Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, we leave behind the noise of the modern world and step quietly into another time, a slower time. So settle comfortably beneath your blankets. Allow your shoulders to soften. Let your breathing become slow and easy. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to finish. Only this story, only this evening, and the quiet path that leads us towards sleep. Tonight's story is The Meadow Where the Bees Returned. So dim the lights. Close your eyes if you wish, and let us begin. The rain had begun before dawn and had continued with such patient determination through the morning that by 11 o'clock the whole of Beacon Street seemed wrapped in a soft grey veil through which the city appeared less like a place where people hurried about their affairs and more like a watercolour left too long beside an open window. From the parlour of the narrow brownstone house where Eleanor Hartwell had lived for almost 33 years, the world beyond the glass appeared distant and slightly blurred. The elm trees lining the street had surrendered nearly all their autumn leaves, and the few that remained clung stubbornly to the higher branches, trembling whenever a gust of wind moved along the row of houses. Eleanor sat beside the front window, in the chair she always occupied during the late morning hours. The chair had belonged to her husband. No one had ever formally decided that it should become hers after his death. It had simply happened in the way many household changes happen, without announcement and without discussion, until one day the new arrangement felt older than the old one. A small table stood beside her. Upon it rested a china teacup, decorated with fading blue forget-me-nots, a pair of reading spectacles, and a book she had not yet opened, despite carrying it from room to room for almost a week. The tea had long since cooled. A thin slice of lemon floated quietly against the porcelain. Eleanor did not notice. Her attention had drifted toward the rain. It often did these days. Not because she particularly enjoyed rainy weather, though she had never minded it, but because rain seemed to ask very little of a person. One could sit beside it for hours. One could listen. One could think, or not think at all. The grandfather clock near the staircase marked the passing minutes with a steady, deliberate rhythm that filled the house more completely than conversation had done for many months. Tick, pause, tick, pause. A patient sound, a faithful sound, the sort of sound that continues whether a person is happy or sad, whether they are young or old, whether they remain or leave. William had purchased the clock during the second year of their marriage from a dealer in New York who claimed it had once stood in the drawing room of a sea captain's widow in Connecticut. The story may or may not have been true. William had admitted as much, but he had liked the story and therefore had chosen to believe it. That had been one of his qualities. He had always preferred a pleasant possibility to a dull certainty. Eleanor glanced toward the clock now and found herself smiling very slightly at the memory. The smile lasted only a moment, not because the memory saddened her. That stage had passed, at least mostly. Rather because memories of William had become so familiar that they no longer arrived dramatically. They entered a room quietly, like old friends who knew the house well enough not to knock. His chair remained beside the fireplace. His tobacco jar still occupied the corner of the mantel. A walking stick leaned in the umbrella stand near the front door. Not because Eleanor was unable to move these things. She could have done so at any time. She simply never felt particularly compelled to. When visitors noticed, they occasionally exchanged sympathetic glances. Clara most of all. Clara worried. Daughters often do, especially daughters who live several hundred miles away and must imagine their mothers' lives rather than witness them. Only the previous week, a letter had arrived from Philadelphia. The envelope still rested inside the drawer of Eleanor's writing desk upstairs. She knew nearly every sentence by heart. Clara had written of the children, of little Samuel losing a tooth, of Edward insisting upon wearing his new boots indoors, of a church bazaar, of a neighbor's new carriage. And beneath all these ordinary pieces of news, there had been another message, carefully folded between the lines. Mother, are you well? Mother, are you leaving the house often enough? Mother, are you lonely? Eleanor had smiled while reading it. Then she had folded the letter. Then she had sat for a long time beside the window, exactly as she sat now, because loneliness, she had come to believe, was not quite the right word. Loneliness suggested a sharp absence, a noticeable emptiness, something one felt immediately. What Eleanor experienced was gentler, more gradual. Her life had simply become smaller. The boundaries of it had drawn inward little by little, until entire weeks could pass without anything particularly memorable occurring. There was breakfast, there was correspondence, there was reading, there was church on Sunday, there was tea at 4, there was sleep, and then there was another day, remarkably similar to the one before. Not unhappy, not exactly, simply quiet, very quiet. The rain continued to drift down the window pane. Across the street, a grocer hurried beneath an umbrella. A horse-drawn delivery wagon rolled slowly through the wet afternoon. Far away, a church bell marked the quarter hour. Eleanor watched all of it, and as she watched, she became aware of a thought that had visited her several times during the previous months. A thought so small she rarely spoke it aloud even to herself. It was this. Since William died, she had become a woman without an errand. There had once always been something waiting, a place to go, a person to meet, a plan for next week, a summer journey, a dinner invitation, a book William wished to discuss, a garden to improve, a guest expected on Thursday. Life had once stretched ahead in pleasant little obligations. Now, it seemed content merely to repeat itself. The realization did not arrive painfully. It settled over her as softly as the rain upon the glass, and perhaps because it came so gently, it lingered. The clock continued its faithful ticking. The fire settled quietly in the grate. Outside, another gust of autumn wind carried a scattering of copper leaves down the street. Eleanor lifted her teacup at last. The tea was cold. She laughed softly to herself, a small laugh, the sort one makes when there is nobody else in the room to hear it. Then she rose from William's chair and crossed toward the fireplace. Neither she nor the quiet house could know that, before another week had passed, a letter would arrive from England, carrying with it an old friendship, a forgotten summer, 6 abandoned beehives, and the first true purpose Eleanor Hartwell had possessed in nearly 2 years. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the rain had finally passed and left Boston, beneath one of those pale autumn skies that seemed made not of blue at all, but of pearl and silver, softly illuminated from somewhere beyond the clouds. Eleanor heard the knock shortly after breakfast and thought little of it at first. The postman came most mornings, and in recent years the contents of his satchel had become increasingly predictable. There would be Clara's weekly letter, perhaps a circular from a charitable society, occasionally a note from an old acquaintance whose handwriting she recognized before she even broke the seal. This envelope was different. She noticed that before she had even opened it, the paper was heavier than American stationery, the cream surface faintly textured beneath her fingertips. The stamp carried the image of Queen Victoria, and the postmark bore the name of a town she had not seen written in many years, Yorkshire. For a moment she simply stood in the front hall holding the envelope. The house was very quiet. The grandfather clock marked another minute. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard settled with a faint creak. Outside, a milk wagon passed along the street. Ordinary sounds. Yet the single word upon the envelope seemed to have opened a small door somewhere inside her memory, and behind that door waited sunlight, bees, stone walls, and a summer she had not visited in nearly half a century. She carried the letter into the parlor and sat beside the window before opening it. Perhaps she delayed because age teaches a person that unexpected letters rarely arrive without carrying some change behind them. They are like visitors appearing at the door after many years away. One hesitates before welcoming them inside. At last she unfolded the pages. The letter had been written by a firm of solicitors in North Yorkshire. The language was formal and precise, composed in the careful manner of educated English gentlemen who regarded clarity as a moral obligation. Eleanor read the first paragraph once, then a second time, then returned to the beginning and started again. Miss Beatrice Hawthorne, of Alderwick village, had passed away peacefully in her 74th year. Eleanor lowered the paper slightly. The room seemed suddenly still, not because the news shocked her. The truth was that she had not seen Beatrice in almost 50 years. There had been no correspondence for decades, no Christmas cards, no visits, no recent photographs, yet the name carried a peculiar weight. It belonged not merely to a person, but to an entire chapter of childhood. She continued reading. Miss Hawthorne, having no husband, no children, and no direct heirs, had left her cottage, its surrounding property, and the contents therein, to Miss Eleanor Hartwell of Boston, Massachusetts, whom she described in her final testament as my dearest companion of one unforgettable summer. Eleanor stared at the words. Then she laughed softly, not because anything was amusing, only because life occasionally produced surprises so unlikely that laughter seemed the most reasonable response available. My dearest companion of one unforgettable summer. The phrase sounded exactly like Beatrice. She could hear her voice even now, warm, patient, slightly amused by the world, the voice of a young woman kneeling beside a row of lavender plants while explaining something terribly important about bees to a 10-year-old American girl who had followed her everywhere for 3 months. Without entirely meaning to, Eleanor found herself drifting backward through the years. The summer had been 1848. Her father, who conducted business in Liverpool, had brought the family to England for a season. Most of that time had been spent in Yorkshire with distant relations whose names Eleanor had long forgotten, but among those relations had been a young woman of 26 called Beatrice Hawthorne. At 10 years old, Eleanor had considered her the most fascinating person in the world. Beatrice possessed a gift that some people have and most do not. She never treated children as though they were temporary inconveniences. She spoke to them seriously. She listened to their answers. She explained things patiently. She allowed questions to wander wherever they pleased. Most adults hurried children. Beatrice never did. She had shown Eleanor how to distinguish the scent of thyme from rosemary, simply by crushing a leaf between her fingers. She had taught her how to listen for skylarks hidden above a meadow. She had explained the habits of bees with such affection that they seemed less like insects and more like small citizens engaged in important work. One afternoon, Eleanor had been stung while attempting to inspect a hive more closely than wisdom permitted. The pain had been brief, the tears considerably longer. She remembered sitting upon a low stone wall while Beatrice handed her a slice of apple and waited patiently for the storm to pass. "Bees are not trying to hurt you," Beatrice had said. "They are only trying very hard to find their way home." At 10 years old, Eleanor had thought this a remarkable observation. At 58, she suspected it might contain more truth than she had understood at the time. The memory lingered as sunlight slowly shifted across the carpet. Outside, a breeze moved through the nearly bare branches of the elm trees. Inside, the quiet house seemed to be listening. Eleanor returned her attention to the letter. There was more. The cottage, known as Hawthorne Cottage, remained furnished much as Miss Hawthorne had left it. The property included a small orchard, several outbuildings, a garden, and certain personal papers which the deceased had specifically requested remain in Eleanor's care. Personal papers. The phrase stirred her curiosity. She continued reading until the final page. At the bottom, beneath signatures and seals and formal expressions of condolence, there appeared a handwritten note in a different ink. It had been added separately. Miss Hawthorne requested that Mrs. Hartwell be informed that the wooden box remains where she left it. The key is still beneath the blue teacup. Eleanor stared at the sentence. The wooden box, the blue teacup. She knew exactly what they meant. A memory surfaced with startling clarity. A small writing room overlooking a Yorkshire meadow, a painted blue teacup resting on a shelf, a walnut box with brass hinges, and Beatrice smiling mysteriously whenever Eleanor asked what it contained. "You may open it someday," she had once said, "but not yet." For a long moment, Eleanor remained motionless. The afternoon light had begun to soften. The clock continued its faithful ticking. The fire gave a quiet sigh in the grate, and for the first time in many months, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Not happiness, not excitement. Something smaller, something gentler. Anticipation. The feeling that somewhere ahead, beyond next week and the week after, something awaited her. Something unfinished. Something that belonged to her. That evening she wrote to Clara. 3 days later, her daughter arrived from Philadelphia. The conversation unfolded almost exactly as Eleanor had expected. Clara read the solicitor's letter twice, removed her spectacles, placed them back on again, and then walked to the window where she stood looking out at Beacon Street, as though Yorkshire might somehow be visible from there. "Mother," she said at last, "you cannot possibly mean to cross the Atlantic alone." Eleanor poured tea. "I rather suspect I can. England? Yes. In November? Yes. To inherit a cottage from a woman you have not seen since childhood." Eleanor stirred her tea thoughtfully. "When you say it that way, it does sound somewhat unusual." Clara made a sound that daughters have been making at mothers since the beginning of time. Yet beneath the concern, Eleanor recognized something else. Hope, because Clara had noticed it too. The change, the slight brightness that had returned to her mother's voice, the fact that she was speaking of next month rather than last year, the fact that she had begun making plans. Late that evening, after Clara had retired upstairs and the house had grown quiet once more, Eleanor sat alone beside the fire, with Beatrice's letter folded neatly upon her lap. The flames moved softly behind the grate. The room glowed amber and gold. William's chair stood across from her, exactly where it always had. She looked toward it. Then she smiled, very faintly, as though continuing an old conversation. "I believe," she said softly into the warm stillness of the room, "that I may be going to Yorkshire, and somewhere beyond the dark Atlantic, beyond villages she had not seen since childhood, and roads she no longer remembered. Hawthorne Cottage waited among its silent gardens, its empty beehives, and the long-kept secrets of a woman who had remembered one summer for nearly 50 years. The days that followed seemed to move with an unfamiliar sense of purpose, and Eleanor discovered, not without some surprise, that preparing to leave one's ordinary life required considerably more activity than continuing to live it. There were letters to write, accounts to settle, trunks to inspect, winter clothing to mend, and an astonishing number of practical decisions that appeared whenever a woman proposed crossing an ocean at the age of 58. For nearly 2 years her days had arrived largely empty and waited for her to fill them. Now they arrived already occupied. The change was subtle, yet she felt it immediately. Each morning she woke with something to do. Each evening she found herself pleasantly tired. Several times she caught herself looking ahead rather than behind. It was a habit she had not realized she had lost. November deepened around Boston as preparations continued. The city entered that peculiar season between autumn and winter when the trees stood nearly bare, the harbor winds grew sharper each day, and the early darkness arrived with such determination that lamps were being lit before supper. Thin veils of smoke rose from hundreds of chimneys and drifted across the rooftops beneath low silver clouds, giving the entire city the appearance of a place quietly retreating indoors. On the morning of her departure, Eleanor awoke before dawn. For several moments she remained beneath the blankets listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the ticking clock downstairs, the faint groan of old timbers adjusting to the cold, the distant rumble of wheels somewhere along the street. Soon enough, these sounds would belong to memory. The realization did not sadden her. Rather, it gave them a new tenderness. She dressed slowly in the half-light and descended the stairs, carrying a small lamp whose golden glow trembled gently across the wallpaper. The kitchen was cool and smelled faintly of coal smoke and yesterday's bread. She prepared tea, more from habit than appetite, and stood for several minutes beside the back window, watching the first pale light gather beyond the neighboring rooftops. The sky held the color of pewter. A few leaves still clung stubbornly to the branches of the maple tree beyond the fence. Somewhere nearby a rooster crowed, sounding unexpectedly optimistic for so cold a morning. By 7 o'clock, Clara had arrived. The drive to East Boston took place beneath a sky slowly brightening from silver to pearl. Neither woman spoke continuously. There seemed little need. They had already discussed practical matters many times. Clara had repeated every instruction a loving daughter could reasonably provide. Eleanor had promised repeatedly to write, to telegraph, to eat properly, to avoid carrying heavy luggage, and not to befriend suspicious strangers. The last promise she considered somewhat restrictive. The harbor emerged gradually through the morning mist. Ships stood at anchor beyond the docks, like dark, floating silhouettes, their masts disappearing into low cloud. Seagulls wheeled overhead, crying sharply against the wind, while porters moved along the wharf, carrying trunks and parcels with the brisk efficiency of men accustomed to departures. The Atlantic itself appeared grey, not unfriendly, simply immense. Eleanor stood for a moment, after stepping down from the carriage, and looked toward the waiting steamship. She had imagined this moment many times during the previous weeks. Strangely, now that it had arrived, she felt almost calm. The vessel rose above the harbor like a small iron city, its decks crowded with ropes, lifeboats, and smoking funnels. Sailors moved purposefully along the gangways, while passengers gathered in clusters near piles of luggage. The air smelled of salt, wet timber, coal smoke, and distant seaweed, a smell both fresh and ancient, a smell that seemed to belong to journeys. Clara took her arm. "Are you frightened?" she asked quietly. Eleanor considered the question. "A little." Clara nodded. "So am I." The answer pleased Eleanor more than reassurance might have done. There was honesty in it. For a moment, they stood together, looking toward the ship, mother and daughter, each understanding that something important was beginning. Not dramatic, not tragic, simply important. The sort of moment whose significance only becomes fully visible years afterward. At last the final bell sounded. Passengers began moving toward the gangway. Eleanor embraced her daughter. The embrace lasted longer than either intended. When they finally separated, Clara's eyes were bright. So were Eleanor's, yet neither wept. They had inherited a certain stubborn dignity from generations of practical New England women. Every Sunday, And a telegram from Liverpool. The moment I arrive, Clara smiled. Then Eleanor turned toward the ship. The wooden gangway shifted gently beneath her feet. The harbour wind tugged at her coat as she climbed. Halfway up she paused and looked back. Clara stood below, small among the crowds, one gloved hand raised. Eleanor lifted her own. The distance between them already seemed larger than it had a minute before. Then she stepped aboard. For the first time in many years, she was truly leaving. The crossing occupied 9 days. At first, the Atlantic behaved exactly as November oceans are known to behave. Great grey swells rolled endlessly beneath the ship, lifting and lowering it with slow determination. The horizon appeared and vanished behind curtains of mist. Rain visited frequently. Wind rattled doors and whistled through railings. Several passengers became dramatically seasick. Eleanor felt only moderately miserable. After the second day, she discovered a rhythm: breakfast, reading, a short walk along the promenade deck whenever the weather allowed, tea in the afternoon, letters written but not yet posted, quiet observation. The ocean encouraged contemplation. There was surprisingly little else to do. The days unfolded in a manner unlike life on land. Hours seemed wider. Conversations moved more slowly. Even the most energetic passengers eventually surrendered to the peculiar calm imposed by an endless horizon. On the fourth afternoon, when the sea had temporarily settled and a pale sun appeared between clouds, Eleanor carried a book onto the deck and wrapped herself in a wool blanket supplied by a kindly steward. She attempted to read. Instead, she watched the water. The Atlantic stretched outward in every direction, changing constantly, yet always remaining itself. Some moments it appeared silver, others slate blue, others nearly black. Long ribbons of sunlight drifted across its surface and disappeared. A curious peace settled over her. Not happiness exactly, not yet. Something quieter. The feeling of being suspended between two lives. Behind her lay the familiar rooms of Boston. Ahead lay Yorkshire, and between them existed only sky and sea. One evening, near sunset, she found herself thinking about William, not with the sharp ache that had accompanied the first months after his death. That ache had softened. What remained now resembled longing mixed with gratitude. She imagined telling him about Beatrice's letter, about the cottage, about the bees, about the absurdity of finding oneself an heiress at 58. He would have enjoyed the story immensely. More than that, he would have insisted she go. The certainty comforted her. As darkness gathered, she remained on deck longer than usual. Above the Atlantic, the stars appeared in astonishing numbers, without city lights to dim them. They seemed brighter and nearer than any she had seen before. Thousands upon thousands shimmered across the cold heavens, while the ship moved steadily beneath them. For a long time, Eleanor stood at the rail. The ocean below reflected fragments of starlight. The wind smelled clean and distant. And somewhere in that immense darkness, she experienced a sensation she had not felt since William's death. Curiosity. Simple curiosity. What would Alderwick look like? Did Hawthorne Cottage still stand exactly as she remembered? Would the blue teacup truly be waiting? Would the bees ever return? The questions drifted through her thoughts like stars across water. For once, she did not need answers immediately. It was enough that the questions existed, and so the ship continued eastward through the autumn night, carrying Eleanor toward Yorkshire, toward Beatrice's cottage, and toward a chapter of life she could not yet imagine, but was slowly beginning to welcome. England announced itself first by rain, not a storm, not even a proper shower, only a fine grey mist drifting across the windows of the train as Eleanor left Liverpool the morning after her arrival, softening the outlines of warehouses and church towers and distant factory chimneys until the whole landscape seemed painted in diluted watercolors. She sat alone in a first-class compartment with a wool traveling rug spread across her knees and watched the country unfold beyond the glass. The previous evening had been spent quietly at a hotel overlooking the Mersey. She had arrived tired from the crossing, yet unwilling to sleep immediately, and so had sat by her window for nearly an hour, watching the lights of ships moving slowly through the dark harbour, while rain traced delicate paths across the panes. England had smelled different from America. She had noticed it the moment she stepped ashore. The air carried damp stone, wet earth, coal smoke, and something green beneath it all, something ancient and growing. The scent lingered with her now. As the train moved northward through Lancashire and into Yorkshire, the cities gradually loosened their hold upon the landscape. Rows of brick terraces gave way to fields. Factory chimneys disappeared. Stone walls began appearing across the hillsides, running mile after mile, like grey threads, stitched carefully across green cloth. The sight stirred something deep within her memory. She had forgotten the walls, or rather she had forgotten how many of them there were. Every meadow seemed bordered by them, every hill, every lane. They wandered over the countryside with such patient certainty that Eleanor found herself smiling. America built fences, England built walls. The distinction somehow seemed important. Outside, sheep grazed beneath low clouds. Their wool appeared almost luminous against the dark grass. Occasionally the train passed a village gathered around a church tower that looked older than most American towns. Smoke drifted upward from cottage chimneys. Laundry fluttered faintly in small gardens. Children in caps ran alongside station platforms before vanishing behind hedges and orchards. The countryside possessed a softness she had not expected. Nothing was grand, nothing dramatic. Instead, there existed a quiet accumulation of beauty, a curved stone bridge, a stream reflecting pale sky, a row of beech trees holding the last copper leaves of autumn, a farmhouse crouched against a hillside as though sheltering from a wind that had been blowing for centuries. The further north they travelled, the more familiar it all began to seem. Not familiar in the sense of recognition, rather familiar in the way certain dreams feel familiar, as though she had carried fragments of these landscapes within her for years without realizing it. Near noon, the train stopped at a small market town where she changed onto a branch line. The second train was humbler, 3 carriages, a cheerful conductor, seats polished by generations of travelers. The compartment smelled faintly of damp wool, leather, and old wood warmed by coal heat, the sort of smell that belongs entirely to railways. The branch line wound slowly through narrower valleys. Fields became smaller, the villages fewer. At one tiny station, a woman in a blue shawl stood beside baskets of apples, while a sleepy terrier waited beneath a bench. At another, a station master emerged, carrying a watering can, larger than seemed entirely necessary. Eleanor observed everything. The longer she travelled, the more she felt herself shedding the habits of Boston, the hurry, the schedules, the constant attention to clocks. Time here appeared to move differently. Even the trains seemed less concerned about arriving than about eventually getting there. By late afternoon, the conductor appeared beside her compartment door. "Alderwick next, ma'am." His Yorkshire accent softened the words. Eleanor closed her book. She had not read a single page. The landscape outside had proven far more interesting. A few minutes later, the train slowed. Steam drifted past the windows. The wheels clattered gently over points. And at last, Alderwick appeared. The station consisted of a single platform, a small stone building, and a hanging basket whose summer flowers had long since surrendered to autumn. A black cat sat upon the baggage trolley. The cat appeared entirely responsible for the station. Eleanor rather suspected it was. The train stopped. Silence followed. Not complete silence, only country silence. The distant call of rooks the rustle of wind through bare branches, the soft ticking of cooling metal. She stepped down onto the platform. The air felt colder here, cleaner too. A faint scent of wood smoke drifted from somewhere beyond the station yard. For a moment, she simply stood. The journey was finished. She had arrived. And yet what struck her most strongly was not excitement. It was recognition, not of the station, not even of the village, but of the feeling, the strange certainty that a place could remember a person long after that person had forgotten the place. A gentleman waited beside the station gate. He appeared to be somewhere in his 60s, tall and spare, with silver hair beneath a brown felt hat and the weathered complexion of a man accustomed to walking outdoors in every season. When he saw her, he removed his hat immediately. His expression brightened. "Mrs. Hartwell, I believe." His voice carried the calm courtesy of another age. Eleanor smiled. "I am." He introduced himself as Mr. Arthur Bellamy, solicitor, executor of Beatrice Hawthorne's estate, and occasional churchwarden, though the latter title seemed offered with equal pride. Within minutes he had secured her trunk onto a small pony cart waiting outside the station. The pony, a sturdy chestnut creature named Pippin, regarded Eleanor with polite skepticism. "You'll have to forgive him," Mr. Bellamy said. "He distrusts newcomers until they've survived at least one journey." Eleanor laughed. The pony remained unconvinced. The road from the station wound through the village. Alderwick proved smaller than she remembered and somehow lovelier. Cottages built from honey-colored stone stood shoulder to shoulder along a narrow lane. Their windows glowed softly in the gathering dusk. Gardens lay sleeping behind low walls. Ivy climbed chimneys. A baker's shop released the warm fragrance of fresh bread into the cooling air. Several villagers nodded as the cart passed. One elderly woman waved. A child attempted to race the pony and was gently defeated. The church stood upon a small rise at the edge of the village, its square tower emerging from a cluster of yew trees, dark against the evening sky. Beyond the village, the road climbed gradually. Fields opened on either side. The western horizon glowed pale gold beneath bands of grey cloud. A flock of starlings crossed the sky like drifting smoke. Then, quite suddenly, Mr. Bellamy pointed ahead. "There she is." Eleanor looked. For a moment she could not speak. Hawthorne Cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane, bordered by stone walls and elder hedges. Its walls glowed softly in the fading light, the warm Yorkshire stone appearing almost golden beneath the evening sky. A single chimney released a thin ribbon of smoke. Behind the cottage stood an orchard of old apple trees, whose branches stretched dark and graceful against the horizon. The house seemed smaller than memory. Most beloved places do, yet it remained unmistakably itself. The roof, the windows, the garden wall. Even from this distance she recognized them. Recognition arrived so suddenly that it felt almost physical. 48 years vanished. For a heartbeat, she was 10 years old again, running across summer grass while bees drifted lazily among lavender blossoms. The cart continued forward. The wheels crunched softly over gravel. The gate stood open. No one waited there. No welcoming figure appeared at the door. Beatrice was gone. The realization settled quietly upon her. Yet the cottage did not feel empty. It felt expectant, as though every stone and beam and window had spent the last weeks preparing itself for her arrival. The pony stopped. Mr. Bellamy climbed down first. Neither spoke immediately. The evening light lingered upon the cottage walls. Somewhere nearby, a robin sang a final note before nightfall. Then Eleanor stepped onto the gravel path and looked toward the front door. For a long moment, she simply stood there. Home, she thought. Not because she had lived here, not because she belonged here, but because some part of her story had begun here, long ago. And now, after crossing an ocean and half a lifetime, She had finally come back to discover how it ended. Mr. Bellamy remained only long enough to ensure that Eleanor possessed everything necessary for her first evening. A basket of bread and cheese had been left in the kitchen by a neighbor. The coal scuttle beside the hearth was full. Fresh water stood ready in a blue earthenware pitcher upon the dresser. A maid from the village would come the following morning to help settle practical matters, and if any difficulty arose during the night, Mr. Bellamy assured her that the Bellamy house stood less than 10 minutes away along the lane. Then, after one final expression of welcome, he climbed back onto the pony cart and disappeared slowly into the gathering dusk. Eleanor stood at the doorway, watching until both cart and pony vanished beyond the hedgerow. The evening became noticeably quieter after that. Not silent, never silent. Country houses possess their own language. The faint rustle of ivy against stone, the distant complaint of a rook settling into its tree, wind moving through orchard branches, a gate somewhere gently shifting upon old hinges. Small sounds, patient sounds, the sort of sounds one notices only when cities are far away. At last she stepped inside and closed the door. The cottage received her with the smell she remembered. Not exactly. Memory always improves things slightly, yet close enough. Beeswax, old wood, lavender, a trace of coal smoke, and beneath everything else the scent of books that had spent decades quietly absorbing seasons. The hall was narrow and low-ceilinged. Oak beams crossed overhead, darkened by time until they appeared almost black. The flagstones beneath her feet had been worn smooth by generations of footsteps. For a moment Eleanor rested her gloved hand against the wall. The stone felt cool, solid, unchanged. She found herself wondering how many times Beatrice had crossed this same hall. How many winter evenings she had hung her coat upon the iron hooks beside the door. How many mornings she had opened the shutters and looked toward the orchard. Thousands, no doubt. Enough that the house itself seemed shaped by her habits. The sitting room lay beyond. A fire had already been laid in the grate. Eleanor knelt and coaxed it gently to life. Soon small flames flickered among the coals, casting amber light across the room. The shadows shifted. Furniture emerged from darkness. A high-backed armchair stood beside the hearth. A round table occupied the center of the room. Books lined shelves built into the walls. Nothing appeared grand, nothing fashionable, yet everything seemed chosen with care. The room possessed that rare quality found only in houses where people have lived thoughtfully for many years. Nothing unnecessary remained. Nothing beloved had been discarded. Eleanor removed her gloves and walked slowly through the cottage. The kitchen came first, then a small pantry, then a dining room, scarcely larger than some closets she had seen in Boston. Each room carried traces of Beatrice. Not dramatic traces, no portraits, no monuments, only the small evidence of a life attentively lived, a gardening apron hanging behind a door, pressed flowers tucked between pages of a cookbook, a pair of spectacles resting atop a volume of poetry, a shawl folded neatly over the arm of a chair. The effect was strangely comforting. Beatrice felt absent, yet she also felt nearby, as though she had merely stepped outside for an afternoon walk and might return at any moment carrying herbs or apples in a basket. The last room Eleanor visited before supper stood at the rear of the cottage, overlooking the orchard, the writing room. She recognized it immediately. The years disappeared so quickly that she almost expected to see her younger self standing beside the window. The room was smaller than memory. Everything seemed smaller, yet it remained exactly where it had always been. The narrow desk beneath the window, the shelves, the worn rug, the brass reading lamp. Even the view beyond the glass remained familiar. The orchard stretched toward the western fields, its branches bare now against the fading sky. A few stubborn apples still hung among the upper limbs, glowing softly in the last light of day. Eleanor crossed the room slowly. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the desk. Dust had settled lightly upon its surface. Not neglect, simply time. She stood before the shelves. Books, journals, botanical guides, collections of poetry, travel narratives. Beatrice's mind seemed preserved there exactly as her garden remained preserved outside, patiently, orderly, waiting. Then Eleanor noticed it, the blue teacup. It sat upon the third shelf, exactly where memory had placed it. The color had faded slightly over the years, yet the delicate painted cornflowers remained visible along its side. For a long moment, she simply stared. The sight affected her more deeply than she expected, because unlike the furniture, unlike the cottage itself, this object belonged entirely to a memory shared between two people. She remembered sitting in this room as a child while Beatrice wrote letters. She remembered asking endless questions. She remembered being told repeatedly not to touch the blue teacup. Naturally, she had touched it whenever possible. The memory made her smile. Outside, darkness settled fully across the orchard. The window reflected the room now rather than the landscape beyond it. The fire crackled faintly in the sitting room. A clock somewhere downstairs marked the passing minutes. Eleanor stepped closer. The teacup remained exactly where it had stood nearly 50 years earlier. And suddenly, she remembered the note. The key is still beneath the blue teacup. A curious stillness settled over her. Not suspense, not excitement, something quieter. The awareness that one was standing at the edge of a story and had finally reached the page where it truly began. Very carefully, she lifted the teacup. A small iron key rested beneath it. Nothing more. No note, no explanation, only a key scarcely longer than her finger, darkened by age and polished slightly where countless hands had once touched it. Eleanor picked it up. The metal felt cool against her palm. Somewhere within the cottage, a floorboard creaked softly. The fire settled in the grate, and in that quiet Yorkshire room, while darkness gathered beyond the orchard and the first stars appeared above the hills, Eleanor stood holding the key and wondered what secret Beatrice Hawthorne had spent nearly half a century waiting to share. Tomorrow, she thought, whatever waited could wait one more night. Yet even as she returned the teacup gently to its place, she found herself glancing once more toward the shelves, toward the key, toward the mystery that had crossed an ocean to find her. Outside, beyond the dark glass of the window, the orchard slept beneath the November sky. And somewhere beyond the orchard, unseen in the darkness, stood the old beehives Beatrice had loved. Empty now, silent, waiting. Eleanor slept more soundly than she had expected. The cottage seemed to gather silence around itself during the night, not the heavy silence of empty houses, but the gentle quiet of a place accustomed to rest. The wind moved softly beyond the walls. Once or twice she heard rain tapping lightly against the window panes, and somewhere before dawn, an owl called from the orchard. When she opened her eyes the following morning, pale sunlight was already filtering through the curtains. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she saw the unfamiliar beams overhead, the small brass washstand, the faded floral wallpaper, and memory returned all at once. Yorkshire, Hawthorne Cottage, Beatrice, the key. She lay still for several minutes listening. The house seemed awake, not noisy, simply awake, timbers settling, a kettle gently singing somewhere below, the distant ticking of a clock, the faint rustle of branches beyond the window. It felt remarkably like waking inside a memory. After breakfast, Eleanor wrapped herself in her coat and stepped outside. The morning air carried the particular freshness that follows overnight rain. Every stone seemed washed clean. Tiny droplets clung to the hedgerows and flashed briefly whenever sunlight emerged, from behind the drifting clouds. The garden stretched before her in quiet November dignity. Summer had departed months ago. The roses were sleeping. Most flowers had long surrendered their color, yet the garden possessed a beauty of its own. The herb borders remained neatly ordered. Lavender bushes stood silver-gray beneath the pale light. Rosemary spilled gently over stone edges. Late chrysanthemums still glowed in sheltered corners, with stubborn touches of gold and burgundy. Nothing felt neglected. The garden appeared to be resting rather than fading. As Eleanor wandered slowly along the paths, she found herself noticing Beatrice everywhere, not literally, simply in the choices that surrounded her. The placement of a bench beneath an apple tree, the careful curve of a gravel path, the way taller plants sheltered smaller ones from the prevailing wind. Everywhere, there were signs of a woman who had spent decades paying attention. Attention, Eleanor reflected, might be one of the purest forms of affection. A person revealed what they loved simply by noticing it. The orchard lay beyond a low stone wall. She passed through a narrow gate and paused. The trees were older now, far older. Several leaned slightly with age. Their bark had become deeply ridged and twisted. Moss covered portions of the trunks, while fallen leaves formed copper-colored carpets beneath the branches. Yet many still carried fruit, not much. Only a few late apples hanging like forgotten ornaments among the limbs. The sight touched her unexpectedly. Age, she thought, did not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it merely meant carrying fewer things more carefully. She smiled at the notion. It sounded exactly like something Beatrice might have said. Near the far end of the orchard stood the beehives. Eleanor recognized them immediately, even from a distance. 3 weathered wooden hives, arranged beside a stone wall, where they could receive the morning sun. She walked toward them slowly. The grass beneath her shoes glistened with moisture. A robin hopped ahead of her for several yards before deciding she was unlikely to provide worms and flying elsewhere. The hives looked smaller than she remembered. The paint had faded. Moss crept along the lower edges. One roof required repair, and yet they remained standing, waiting. She rested a hand gently against the nearest hive. The wood felt cool. No hum greeted her. No movement. No bees entered or departed. The colonies had vanished years ago. Mr. Bellamy had mentioned as much during the previous evening. Yet Eleanor lingered there longer than necessary. The silence seemed almost respectful, as though the hives themselves remembered. A voice behind her interrupted the thought. She came out here every morning. Eleanor turned. An elderly gentleman stood a short distance away, removing his cap politely. He appeared to be somewhere in his 70s, broad-shouldered, despite his age, with weathered hands and a face shaped by decades of outdoor labor. His gray beard was trimmed neatly. His coat carried traces of soil, despite recent brushing. The expression in his eyes immediately suggested kindness. "Mrs. Hartwell, I presume." Eleanor smiled. "And you are?" "Thomas Finch, ma'am." His Yorkshire accent rolled gently through the words. "I've looked after the garden these past 23 years. He glanced toward the hives. Though truthfully, Miss Hawthorne looked after most of it herself. The two began walking slowly through the orchard together. Mr. Finch moved at the comfortable pace of a man who understood that conversations improved when given sufficient time. He pointed out trees planted during various decades. A pear tree from 1859, 2 apple trees added after a severe winter, a row of currant bushes rescued from a neighboring farm. Every plant seemed to possess a history. Every history somehow involved Beatrice. As they walked, Eleanor noticed something curious. Whenever Mr. Finch spoke of Beatrice, he smiled. Not sentimentally, not sadly, simply as one speaks of a person whose company had improved ordinary days. At length they returned to the beehives. Mr. Finch rested both hands upon his walking stick. "She never stopped talking about you, you know." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. About me, the American girl. His eyes twinkled. Those were her exact words. The American girl who asked 100 questions before breakfast. Eleanor laughed despite herself. Only 100. On quieter mornings, perhaps. The old gardener nodded toward the orchard. Whenever visitors came, she'd tell stories about the summer you followed her around the village, about the time you attempted to name every bee in a hive. I did no such thing. You certainly did. His confidence suggested the story had been repeated many times. Eleanor shook her head. I was 10, exactly. For several moments, they stood smiling. Then the humor softened into something gentler. Mr. Finch looked toward the distant hills. She was fond of many people. His voice became quieter, but there weren't many she remembered for 50 years. The words settled between them. Neither hurried to fill the silence. Above the orchard, a pale shaft of sunlight slipped through the clouds. The bare branches shimmered briefly. A breeze moved through the grass, and for the first time since arriving, Eleanor fully understood that she had not been chosen by accident. Beatrice had remembered. Not simply the summer, not simply the friendship. Her. The realization carried an unexpected warmth. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, only a quiet certainty. Like finding a lamp still burning in a window one had assumed was dark. Then, as they turned toward the cottage, Mr. Finch paused once more beside the hives. There have been a few bees lately. Eleanor looked at him. Bees? Only a handful. He nodded thoughtfully. Odd time of year for it, really. I noticed them last month on the ivy blossoms near the south wall. He smiled. Perhaps they're looking for a home. Eleanor followed his gaze toward the silent hives. For a moment, neither spoke. The November sunlight touched the weathered wood. The orchard rustled softly around them, and though the hives remained empty, something about them no longer felt abandoned, only patient, as though they too were waiting for the next chapter to begin. That afternoon, the weather settled into one of those quiet Yorkshire moods that seemed incapable of deciding whether it intended sunshine or rain. A pale brightness drifted behind the clouds for an hour or two, illuminating the hills beyond the orchard with a silver softness, and then vanished again. The air remained still. Not a leaf stirred beneath the apple trees. Even the rooks appeared less inclined than usual to argue among themselves. After Mr. Finch departed, Eleanor returned slowly to the cottage. The conversation lingered with her, particularly his final remark. Perhaps they're looking for a home. The words had been spoken casually enough, yet they remained somewhere in her thoughts as she crossed the garden and entered through the back door. A few bees, only a handful, yet after years of absence, even a handful seemed remarkable. The kitchen felt warm after the cool November air. A kettle simmered gently upon the range. Copper pans reflected small fragments of afternoon light. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked as old houses occasionally do, sounding less like movement and more like memory. Eleanor removed her coat and prepared tea. Then, carrying the tray carefully, she climbed the narrow staircase and made her way once more toward Beatrice's writing room. The key remained in her pocket. She could feel its small weight through the fabric of her dress, not heavy, not urgent, merely present, like a question waiting patiently to be answered. The room appeared different in daylight. The evening before, she had seen only shadows and impressions. Now every detail emerged clearly. The wallpaper, faded by decades of sunlight, the brass lamp upon the desk, the shelves crowded with books, the worn rug before the fireplace. The room possessed the particular atmosphere found only in places where a single person has spent many years thinking quietly. Nothing felt accidental. Nothing felt hurried. Even the arrangement of objects seemed to reflect habits repeated so often they had become invisible. Eleanor sat at the desk, and the chair creaked softly beneath her weight. Outside the window, the orchard stretched away beneath a sky the color of pearl. She rested her hands upon the desktop. The wood had been polished by use. Thousands of letters must have been written here. Thousands of mornings begun. Thousands of evenings concluded. The thought made the room feel curiously inhabited, not haunted. Simply inhabited by attention. Her gaze drifted toward the bookshelves. Botanical guides occupied much of the lower section. Gardening journals, volumes on wildflowers, collections of poetry, several novels, a complete Shakespeare, and then, on the second shelf from the bottom, she noticed a row of identical leather-bound notebooks. There were 12 of them, each carefully labeled in gold ink. And so on, year after year, a small life preserved in volumes. Eleanor selected one at random. The leather felt smooth beneath her fingers. Inside, the handwriting was immediately recognizable. Beatrice's script remained as precise as ever. Not decorative, not fashionable, simply clear. The first pages contained notes about the garden, planting dates, weather observations, the flowering of roses, the arrival of migrating birds. Nothing extraordinary, yet as Eleanor continued reading, she began to understand that Beatrice had not merely kept records, she had paid attention with extraordinary devotion. April 14th. First swallow observed above the south meadow. April 18th. The white pear tree opened 4 days earlier than last year. June 2nd. Lavender near the wall, attracting more bees than usual. July 7th. One hive particularly active despite rain. The entries continued, page after page, year after year. Not dramatic observations, tiny observations, the sort of details most people noticed briefly and then forgot. Yet Beatrice had preserved them all. Reading them felt strangely intimate, more intimate perhaps than reading letters. Letters are written for others. These notes had been written simply because Beatrice loved the things she observed. The realization moved Eleanor unexpectedly. One did not spend decades recording the flowering of lavender unless one genuinely cared whether lavender flowered. A smile touched her face. It seemed entirely characteristic. She reached for another journal, then another. Hours passed unnoticed. Outside the window, the afternoon faded slowly toward evening. The orchard darkened. The clouds lowered. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked 4 o'clock. Still she read. And gradually a pattern emerged. The bees. They appeared everywhere, not merely as part of the garden, as its heart. Every year contained observations about them, their numbers, their habits, their preferences, which flowers they favored, when they swarmed, when they suffered, when they prospered. Beatrice wrote about them with a tenderness that bordered upon affection. October 3rd, 1884. A difficult season. Hive number 2 lost. I missed the sound. May 11th, 1887. Strong honey flow from the orchard blossoms. The whole garden seems alive. August 20th, 1890. Fewer bees this year. I fear something is changing. Eleanor paused. That final entry unsettled her slightly. Something is changing. She turned more pages. The handwriting remained steady. Yet the tone altered, not dramatically, only enough to notice. The later journals contained longer reflections, questions, concerns, observations repeated several times, the bees growing fewer, wildflowers disappearing from neighboring fields, changes in the landscape beyond the village, changes nobody else appeared to notice, or perhaps nobody else thought important. At last, she closed the final journal. The room had grown dim. Evening shadows filled the corners. The orchard beyond the glass was fading into darkness. For several moments, she sat quietly, listening. The cottage seemed very still. Then her eyes drifted toward a small cabinet built into the wall beside the fireplace. It was narrow, old, and fitted with a brass lock. A lock almost exactly the size of the key resting in her pocket. Eleanor looked at it, then at the key, then back at the cabinet. A lesser woman might have opened it immediately. A greater woman perhaps would have waited. Eleanor suspected she belonged somewhere between the two. She rose slowly, crossed the room, and stood before the cabinet. The brass key felt cool in her hand. Outside, beyond the darkening orchard, a single robin sang its final note of the day. Inside the cottage, the clock downstairs began striking 5, and as each measured chime drifted upward through the quiet house, Eleanor inserted the key into the lock and felt it turn with surprising ease. What waited behind the door, she did not yet know, but for the first time since arriving in Yorkshire, she felt certain that she was standing not merely at the beginning of Beatrice's story. She was standing at the threshold of the reason she had been brought here at all. For several moments after the lock yielded, Eleanor did not immediately open the cabinet. The key remained in her hand. The brass handle rested beneath her fingertips, yet she stood motionless beside the fireplace while the last of the afternoon light faded across the room. Outside, a faint drizzle had begun to fall. Tiny droplets touched the window panes with such gentleness that they sounded almost like whispers. The orchard beyond the glass was becoming indistinct, dissolving slowly into layers of grey shadow and silver mist. The familiar Yorkshire evening was gathering itself around the cottage. At length, Eleanor drew a quiet breath and opened the cabinet door. The hinges moved without protest. Whatever lay inside had clearly not been forgotten, only preserved. The interior proved surprisingly simple. There were no bundles of legal documents, no family jewels, no hidden fortune, nothing that would have satisfied the expectations of a sensational novelist. Instead, upon the middle shelf rested a single wooden box. It was made of polished walnut, darkened by age and use, with brass corners worn smooth from many years of handling. The box itself possessed no lock, no ornament, no attempt at mystery. It appeared rather like an object someone reached for frequently, something practical, something beloved. Eleanor lifted it carefully and carried it to the desk. The wood felt heavier than she expected. When she set it down, a faint scent emerged. Cedar, lavender, old paper. The fragrance seemed to belong entirely to Beatrice. For several moments, she simply looked at it. A curious emotion had begun to settle over her. Not anticipation, not anxiety, something gentler. The feeling one experiences before opening a long unread book, written by someone whose voice one has not heard for many years. Finally, she lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of neatly arranged papers, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, several folded maps, a small notebook, a handful of botanical sketches, and resting carefully upon everything else was a sealed envelope. Her name appeared upon it. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. The handwriting was unmistakable. Beatrice's. The sight affected her more than she would later admit. A letter written specifically for her, not a legal instruction, not a formal document. A letter. Outside, rain continued tapping softly against the window. The room seemed to grow quieter. Even the clock downstairs appeared to lower its voice. Eleanor broke the seal. The paper crackled faintly as she unfolded it. For a moment, her eyes simply rested upon the first line. Then she began to read. "My dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, then the bees have not yet come home." She stopped, only for a second, then continued. The sentence seemed so entirely characteristic of Beatrice that Eleanor could almost hear her speaking. "Not," she noticed, "if I have died. Not if you have inherited the cottage. Not if many years have passed. The bees have not yet come home." The letter continued. "My hope, of course, is that I am mistaken. I have spent much of my life believing that nature possesses more patience than people and considerably more wisdom. Yet, during the last 20 years, I have watched certain things disappear from our valley. Wildflowers first, then butterflies, then many of the bees, not all at once, never dramatically, only little by little. You do not notice the moment it happens. Only that one evening you look up and find the shadows have arrived. Eleanor lowered the page slightly. Beyond the window, the rain drifted across the orchard in silver threads. The apple trees stood motionless beneath the darkening sky. She thought of the journals, the repeated observations, the concern hidden quietly between descriptions of roses and weather. Beatrice had seen the change long before anyone else, and she had spent years recording it. The letter continued for several pages. Not once did it become sentimental. Not once did it complain. Instead, it read like a conversation between old friends, separated by time. Beatrice wrote about seasons, about gardens, about village life, about the pleasure of noticing small things. She wrote about Eleanor's childhood visit, recalling details Eleanor herself had forgotten. The day she fell asleep beneath the pear tree. The afternoon she attempted to rescue an injured bumblebee using a teacup and a handkerchief. The endless questions, the endless curiosity. Reading those passages, Eleanor found herself smiling through an unexpected ache of affection. Then, near the middle of the letter, the tone shifted slightly. Not darker, simply more serious. If you have come home, my dear, there is something I hope you might do. I do not ask this because the cottage belongs to you. Houses belong to themselves more than to any person. Nor do I ask it because of sentiment. I ask it because I suspect you will understand. Understanding has always been your particular gift. Eleanor paused again. Outside, the rain had begun to strengthen. Water trickled softly from the eaves. The room seemed wrapped in a cocoon of warmth and weather. She continued reading. In the box you will find a map of the garden. There are places marked in blue. Those are the places where the bees once gathered most abundantly. I began marking them 40 years ago. I continued until I no longer saw enough bees to justify fresh entries. Perhaps I was foolish, perhaps merely stubborn. The distinction grows less important with age. But I have often wondered whether the garden might yet be persuaded to welcome them back. Not by force. Nature never responds well to force. Only by invitation. The final words lingered in the room long after Eleanor reached the end of the page. By invitation. Such a simple phrase, yet it seemed to contain the entire philosophy by which Beatrice had lived. Not command, not control. Invitation. Partnership, patience. The rain continued falling. The fire glowed softly in the grate, and as evening settled fully over Hawthorne Cottage, Eleanor lowered the letter into her lap and looked toward the dark orchard beyond the window. Somewhere out there stood the silent hives. Somewhere out there lay the places marked in blue upon Beatrice's map, and for the first time she began to suspect that the inheritance she had crossed an ocean to receive was not the cottage itself, nor the orchard, nor even the garden. It was a task, a quiet, unfinished task entrusted from one woman to another across half a century. On the desk beside her, untouched until now, lay the folded map, and though she did not open it that evening, her eyes returned to it more than once. Outside, hidden somewhere within the darkness beyond the rain, the old garden waited, patiently, just as the bees had waited, just as Beatrice had waited, for Eleanor to begin. The following morning arrived wrapped in a pale silver mist that seemed to have risen from the earth itself during the night. When Eleanor descended the narrow staircase shortly after sunrise, the cottage windows were already veiled with moisture, and beyond the glass, the orchard appeared softened and distant, every tree reduced to a quiet silhouette, suspended within layers of drifting grey. She lit the kitchen fire, brewed a pot of tea, and carried both cup and folded map to the writing room. The house was still, not empty, simply still. The sort of stillness that belongs to old houses before the world fully wakes. The ticking clock downstairs marked each passing minute with patient certainty. Occasionally, a branch brushed lightly against the exterior wall. Somewhere in the orchard, a blackbird began its morning song. Eleanor unfolded the map carefully upon the desk. It proved larger than she expected, not professionally drawn, not intended for publication. It was clearly the work of a woman who had spent decades walking the same paths and learning every corner of the land by heart. The garden appeared in delicate ink lines, the orchard, the herb borders, the stone walls, the vegetable plots, the hives, the old pond beyond the western meadow. Everything had been recorded, and scattered across the map were perhaps 20 small blue marks. Some stood near flower beds, others beside hedgerows. A few appeared in places Eleanor scarcely remembered. Each mark carried a date written in Beatrice's careful hand: June 1864, May 1872, August 1881, July 1887. The dates stretched across nearly 30 years. For a long while, Eleanor studied them without moving. She found herself imagining Beatrice standing exactly where she now sat, adding each mark one at a time as seasons passed and summers returned. A life measured not by dramatic events, but by observations. A bee discovered upon a blossom, a patch of wildflowers thriving unexpectedly, a place where the garden felt particularly alive. The thought filled her with a curious tenderness. Many people, she reflected, spend their lives recording births, marriages, fortunes, disappointments, and accomplishments. Beatrice had recorded where the bees preferred to land, and somehow that seemed equally important. Perhaps more so. By mid-morning, the mist had begun to lift. Thin shafts of sunlight wandered across the orchard. The damp grass sparkled briefly wherever the light touched it. Eleanor folded the map, slipped it into her coat pocket, and stepped outside. The air smelled wonderfully clean. Rain-washed stone, wet earth, apple leaves slowly surrendering themselves to winter, the sort of fragrance that belongs only to the countryside after several days of gentle rain. She followed the first blue mark toward the southern border of the garden. The path curved between lavender beds, now silver with the season. Beatrice had marked the spot beside a weathered stone bench, sheltered by rosemary and old climbing roses. The flowers themselves had long since finished blooming, yet Eleanor could easily imagine the place in summer. The air thick with fragrance, the stone warm beneath sunlight, the constant movement of bees among the blossoms. As she stood there, she remembered something unexpectedly. Not a significant memory, merely a small one. She was perhaps 11 years old. Beatrice had been reading beneath this very bench, while Eleanor lay in the grass pretending to watch clouds. At some point, a bee had landed upon her sleeve. Most children would have cried out. Eleanor had instead remained perfectly still. When Beatrice later asked why, she had answered with great seriousness that she did not wish to interrupt the bee's business. The memory returned so clearly that she laughed aloud. The sound startled a robin from the hedge. The bird vanished into the orchard, and for a moment, the years between then and now seemed astonishingly thin. The second mark lay beyond the orchard wall. A narrow footpath led toward a small meadow Eleanor had entirely forgotten existed. The grass there had grown long. Late autumn had turned it golden. Seed heads swayed gently whenever the breeze crossed the field. At the center stood an ancient hawthorn tree. Its twisted branches spread wide above the meadow, like the arms of some patient guardian. Beneath the tree, Beatrice had made another blue mark. June 1878. Eleanor stood beneath the branches and looked around. The village could barely be seen from here, only distant rooftops beyond hedgerows. The place felt secluded, hidden. She understood immediately why Beatrice had loved it. The meadow possessed a rare quality of quietness, not the absence of sound, the presence of peace. Wind moved softly through dry grasses. Somewhere far away, sheep called across a field. A church bell drifted faintly from the village. Everything seemed woven together into a single gentle harmony. Near the base of the hawthorn, she noticed something unexpected. A cluster of late wildflowers still survived beside the roots. Tiny blossoms, nothing remarkable, yet they persisted despite the season. Eleanor knelt to examine them. Their petals trembled slightly in the breeze, and suddenly she understood something about Beatrice's map. The blue marks were not merely records, they were invitations. Each location represented a place where attention had been paid, a place where someone had paused long enough to notice life unfolding quietly. The realization accompanied her throughout the afternoon. One blue mark led her beside the old pond beyond the western meadow. Another brought her to a forgotten corner where foxgloves once flourished. A third stood beside a gap in the stone wall through which sunlight lingered longer than elsewhere in the garden. Everywhere she went, memories emerged. Not grand memories, small ones. A conversation, a lesson, a summer afternoon. The sound of Beatrice's laughter carried across the orchard. The scent of honey warming in the kitchen. The feeling of running through tall grass while the church bell rang in the distance. By late afternoon, Eleanor found herself standing beside the final blue mark. It lay nearest the hives, closer than all the others. A simple spot beneath an old apple tree whose branches stretched protectively over the weathered boxes. The date written beside it was the most recent on the map, May 1891. Only a year before Beatrice's death. For a long while, Eleanor remained there without moving. The orchard glowed softly beneath the declining light. Clouds drifted slowly across the Yorkshire sky. The hive stood silent beside the wall, and yet the silence no longer seemed empty. It felt expectant, as though the garden itself had not forgotten what it had once been. As though somewhere beneath the sleeping roots and dormant stems and winter-bound soil, life remained quietly at work, waiting, preparing, trusting the seasons to return. Eleanor rested one hand against the trunk of the apple tree and looked toward the hives. Then she unfolded the map once more. Near the bottom, almost hidden beneath a fold in the paper, she noticed a line she had not seen before. The handwriting was faint, added years after the original drawing. If the bees ever return, begin here. For several moments, she simply stared at the words. The orchard lay silent around her. The afternoon light deepened toward gold. A rook crossed the sky above the fields, and standing beneath the old apple tree, with Beatrice's map in her hands and the empty hives before her, Eleanor felt the first quiet stirrings of purpose. Not obligation, not duty, something gentler, the beginning of belonging. The following day dawned brighter than any Eleanor had yet seen since arriving in Yorkshire. The rain had finally withdrawn during the night, leaving behind a sky washed clean of clouds and a pale winter sunlight that seemed determined to make the most of its brief appearance. When Eleanor opened the kitchen door shortly after breakfast, the garden greeted her with a freshness almost startling in its clarity. Every blade of grass carried droplets of light. The stone walls appeared newly scrubbed. The orchard stretched away beneath a sky so delicately blue that it seemed painted rather than natural. Even the air felt different, sharper, livelier, as though the valley itself had taken a long breath and awakened. Eleanor spent much of the morning near the hives. She had brought a notebook from the writing room and settled herself beneath the apple tree where Beatrice had made the final blue mark upon the map. From time to time she glanced between the weathered hives and the pages of the journals she had carried outside. The task before her remained unclear. She knew only that Beatrice had wanted the garden restored in some fashion. Not restored to a particular year, not restored to some impossible perfection, simply restored to welcome life again. The distinction seemed important. Gardens, she suspected, were rather like people. One could not return them to the past. One could only help them become themselves once more. The thought occupied her for some time, so completely, in fact, that she failed to notice someone approaching along the orchard path. A voice suddenly spoke behind her. "You're sitting in Miss Hawthorne's place." Eleanor looked up. A young girl stood several yards away, holding a wicker basket filled with apples. She appeared to be perhaps 16 years old, with dark hair escaping from beneath a wool bonnet and bright grey eyes that regarded Eleanor with the frank curiosity possessed only by children and very elderly ladies. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. One boot was muddier than the other. The basket seemed far too heavy for comfort, yet she carried it as though unaware of the fact. For several moments, neither spoke. The girl examined Eleanor. Eleanor examined the girl. At last the stranger nodded. "You're the American." The statement carried no accusation, only certainty. Eleanor smiled. "I begin to suspect that is my official title in Yorkshire." The girl's expression remained serious for nearly 2 seconds before surrendering to laughter. A pleasant laugh, quick and genuine. "Oh, it absolutely is." She shifted the basket to her other arm. "At least in the village. That is unfortunate." "Not really." The girl considered the matter. "We've had 3 blacksmiths named Henry in the last 10 years. Distinguishing people becomes necessary." Eleanor found herself laughing. The explanation possessed a practical logic difficult to challenge. The girl approached. "I am Lucy Finch, Mr. Finch's granddaughter." "Granddaughter," Lucy nodded, "though grandfather insists on introducing me as his assistant gardener, which sounds much more respectable." Her eyes moved immediately toward the notebook resting on Eleanor's lap, then toward the hives, then toward the journals. The sequence suggested a mind permanently occupied by questions. "You've found the map, haven't you?" Eleanor blinked. "The map? The blue marks?" Lucy said it casually, as though discussing weather. "Miss Hawthorne used to talk about them." For a moment, Eleanor simply stared. Then she gestured toward the grass beside her. Lucy accepted the invitation instantly and sat down, not cautiously, not politely, with the confidence of someone who had spent her entire childhood sitting upon the ground whenever a suitable patch of ground presented itself. The orchard spread around them in quiet sunlight. Above, the bare branches of the apple tree traced delicate patterns against the sky. A robin landed briefly upon one hive before darting away again. For a while Lucy watched the hives, then she spoke. People thought she was eccentric. The words might have sounded unkind from another person. From Lucy, they sounded affectionate. "Did you?" Lucy considered. "A little. That's honest." It seemed sensible to be honest about it. The girl pulled a blade of grass from the ground. Most people worried about crops or sheep or weather. Miss Hawthorne worried about whether bumblebees preferred one hedge over another. She smiled softly. "Though now that I say it aloud, it sounds rather wonderful." Eleanor looked toward the orchard. "It does." The smile lingered between them. Not the smile of strangers. The smile of 2 people discovering they admired the same absent friend. For some time, Lucy spoke of Beatrice. Not dramatically, simply through small stories. The sort of stories that survive because they are repeated often. How Beatrice once delayed an entire church picnic because she refused to allow a wagon wheel to crush a patch of wildflowers. How she regularly brought injured birds into the cottage, despite possessing no obvious talent for veterinary medicine. how she occasionally forgot conversations halfway through because she had noticed an interesting insect. Each story seemed entirely believable. Each added another piece to the portrait Eleanor had been assembling since her arrival. The woman became more complete, more human, more lovable. The morning drifted gradually toward afternoon. Sunlight moved across the orchard. The shadows of branches shifted slowly over the grass. And before Eleanor quite realized it, she found herself speaking not only about Beatrice, but about Boston, about her daughter, Clara, about the years that had passed, about the peculiar feeling of returning somewhere that belonged simultaneously to memory and reality. Lucy listened attentively. Then, after a thoughtful silence, she asked a question. It was asked so simply that Eleanor almost missed its significance. "Are you staying?" The orchard seemed quieter afterward. A breeze moved through the upper branches. Somewhere beyond the stone wall, a sheep bleated. Eleanor looked toward the cottage, the old roof, the chimney, the windows reflecting winter sunlight, then toward the hives, then toward the map folded beside her. "I don't know," she admitted. Lucy nodded slowly, as though she had expected precisely that answer. "I hope you do." There was no pressure in the words, no pleading, only sincerity. The girl rose, lifting her basket once more. As she prepared to leave, she glanced back toward the hives. "You know," she said, "Grandfather says bees return more often than people realize." Eleanor smiled. "Does he?" "He says most creatures spend their lives searching for places that feel safe." Lucy adjusted her bonnet. "Perhaps people do the same." With that, she continued down the orchard path, carrying her basket toward the village. The sunlight followed her between the trees until she disappeared beyond the stone wall. For a long while, Eleanor remained beneath the apple tree. The orchard seemed larger than before, the cottage warmer, the future slightly less uncertain, and although she could not yet have explained why, Lucy's question lingered with her throughout the remainder of the day. "Are you staying?" It was, Eleanor reflected, exactly the sort of question a child could ask and an adult might spend months answering. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm, as though Hawthorne Cottage had quietly accepted Eleanor's presence and was teaching her, little by little, the habits of its own unhurried life. Each morning began with the lighting of the kitchen fire, then tea, then a slow circuit of the garden before the frost had entirely lifted from the grass. The cottage seemed to approve of routine. Everything within it appeared shaped by repetition. The worn stone threshold beside the back door, the smooth banister polished by generations of hands, the slight hollow in the arm of Beatrice's favorite chair. Each object suggested not grand events but accumulated days, and Eleanor found herself comforted by that. There is a particular peace in places where nothing has ever happened quickly. By the middle of November, the trees had surrendered almost all their leaves. The orchard floor had become a patchwork of gold, russet, and brown. When the wind stirred, which it occasionally did in the afternoons, a few reluctant leaves detached themselves from the highest branches and drifted slowly downward with a dignity that made falling seem less like an ending than a thoughtful decision. The bees appeared only rarely now, a solitary worker now and then, a late wanderer, a final explorer, reluctant to admit the season had changed. Yet whenever Eleanor saw one, she found herself stopping whatever she was doing to watch. Beatrice's habit, she suspected, or perhaps her influence. One bright morning, Lucy Finch arrived, carrying a basket covered with a checked cloth and enough energy to animate half the village. The girl entered through the garden gate without ceremony, crossed the orchard at an impressive pace, and appeared at the kitchen door before Eleanor had even noticed her approaching. "I've brought seed cakes." She placed the basket upon the table. And grandfather says, "You've been looking at maps." Eleanor laughed. "I see village news travels efficiently. Nothing travels faster than information nobody is supposed to know." Lucy removed her bonnet. Except perhaps geese. The comparison seemed entirely satisfactory to her. She accepted tea, accepted 2 seed cakes, accepted a third shortly afterward, and then, having settled herself comfortably beside the fire, began asking questions about the journals. Eleanor soon discovered that Lucy possessed an extraordinary memory for local stories. Not dates, never dates. Dates bored her. But stories attached themselves to her mind with remarkable persistence. She knew who had planted various hedgerows, who had built particular walls, who had once fallen into the mill pond, who had courted whom, who had married whom, and who very definitely should not have married whom. The village appeared to exist within her imagination as a vast interconnected web of anecdotes. At length Eleanor fetched one of Beatrice's later journals from the writing room. "I found something yesterday." Lucy leaned forward immediately. The journal opened near the final pages. Several entries had been marked with small slips of paper. Eleanor turned to one dated June 1888. She read aloud. "The meadow beyond Hawthorne Rise blooms more thinly each year. Fewer knapweeds, fewer cornflowers, fewer bees. Mr. Wilkes says the field is more profitable now. I do not doubt it. Yet I wonder whether profit and beauty are always required to quarrel." Lucy frowned. "Hawthorne Rise? Do you know it?" "Of course." The answer arrived instantly. "It's Wilkes' farm." Eleanor continued, turning pages. Another entry, July 1889. "Only 3 bumblebees observed in Bee Meadow this morning." The silence was more noticeable than the absence. This time, Lucy sat upright. "Bee Meadow?" Eleanor looked up. "You know it?" "No." Lucy blinked. "That's the strange part." She leaned closer. "I've never heard of Bee Meadow." The observation surprised them both. Over the following half hour, they searched through journal after journal. The references appeared repeatedly. Bee Meadow, the Old Meadow, the Western Meadow, the flower field, always accompanied by descriptions of butterflies, wildflowers, and astonishing numbers of bees. Yet neither the current village maps nor Beatrice's later map contained any place by that name. At last Lucy stood abruptly. "Wait." She hurried toward the bookshelf. Among the volumes rested several old parish directories and county records. Lucy began pulling them free with enthusiastic determination. Dust rose, books accumulated, a minor avalanche developed upon the floor. By noon, both women sat surrounded by paper. The room smelled pleasantly of old leather bindings and wood smoke. Outside, sunlight drifted across the orchard. Inside, history slowly revealed itself. The answer appeared unexpectedly in a survey map nearly 30 years old. Lucy found it first. "There!" Eleanor crossed immediately to her side. A faded field occupied the western edge of the village, and written across it in careful script were 2 words, Bee Meadow. For several moments, neither spoke. The name seemed oddly moving, not because it was important, because it had nearly vanished, a place remembered by one woman, then forgotten. Lucy traced the faded outline with her fingertip. "But it doesn't exist anymore. Are you certain?" She nodded. "Wilkes joined 3 fields together, years ago." Eleanor studied the map. The meadow had once bordered a stream, a hedgerow, several small woodlands, ideal conditions for wildflowers, ideal conditions for bees. She thought suddenly of Beatrice walking there, year after year, watching the changes, recording them quietly, while the rest of the village concerned itself with practical matters. A curious sadness touched her, not grief, something gentler, the sorrow one feels when discovering a beautiful thing disappeared while nobody was paying attention. The afternoon passed beneath a soft amber light. Clouds gathered slowly beyond the hills. A kettle sang upon the stove. Lucy continued sorting through records, while Eleanor returned to the journals. And somewhere between one page and the next, she discovered another note, short, written only months before Beatrice's death. If the bees are ever to return, the meadow must return first. Eleanor read the sentence twice, then a third time. The room seemed suddenly very still. The fire crackled softly. A branch tapped against the window. Lucy looked up. "What is it?" Eleanor handed her the journal. The girl read the line, then looked toward the orchard, then toward the distant western fields beyond the window. Neither spoke for some time. Outside, the afternoon light was fading. The valley stretched quietly beneath the approaching evening. The fields looked peaceful from this distance, timeless. Yet Eleanor now understood something she had not understood before. The bees had not disappeared from the garden alone. The garden had merely reflected something larger, a loss that extended across the entire valley. A loss Beatrice had spent years observing, and perhaps, in her own quiet way, preparing someone else to notice. For the first time since arriving in Yorkshire, Eleanor began to suspect that restoring the cottage garden might only be the beginning, beyond the orchard, beyond the stone walls, beyond the sleeping hives. Another piece of the story waited, and it was growing quietly in the western fields where Meadow had once bloomed beneath thousands of wings. The morning chosen for their expedition arrived beneath a sky of remarkable clarity. During the night, a sharp frost had settled across the valley, whitening every field and hedgerow with a delicate silver coating that sparkled whenever the sunlight touched it. From the upper window of Hawthorne Cottage, Eleanor could see the countryside stretching away in gentle folds toward the distant hills, each meadow outlined by ancient stone walls that seemed to emerge naturally from the earth itself. The landscape possessed that peculiar beauty belonging only to late autumn, not the abundance of summer, not yet the severity of winter, a quieter beauty, one built from soft colors and long shadows, and the feeling that the world was drawing inward to rest. By 9:30, Thomas Finch arrived at the cottage gate, carrying a walking stick and wearing the expression of a man who had agreed to an adventure while remaining slightly suspicious of adventures in general. Lucy accompanied him, naturally. No force on earth, Eleanor suspected, would have prevented Lucy from attending. The girl appeared equipped for an expedition of far greater magnitude than the one proposed. She carried a notebook, a small parcel of sandwiches, a length of string whose purpose remained mysterious, and a degree of optimism capable of sustaining several less enthusiastic companions. "I've brought provisions," she announced. "We are walking less than 2 miles, said her grandfather. "One never knows." Thomas shook his head. "I raised her badly. You raised me wonderfully." That is exactly the sort of thing a badly raised child would say. The exchange appeared well rehearsed. Eleanor found herself smiling before they had even begun their journey. Together they followed the narrow lane leading west from the village. The road wound gently between stone walls, darkened by centuries of rain and weather, passing cottages whose chimneys released thin streams of smoke into the bright air. Small gardens slept beneath the season's frost. Holly bushes gleamed beside doorways. Somewhere behind a hedge a dog barked once, and then apparently reconsidered the matter. The village gradually disappeared behind them. The countryside opened. Fields spread outward beneath the pale sunlight. Sheep grazed upon distant slopes, appearing from afar like scattered fragments of cloud that had descended to earth and forgotten how to return to the sky. The air felt wonderfully clean. Every breath carried traces of damp grass, cold stone, and wood smoke drifting from unseen farmhouses. Eleanor had forgotten how spacious Yorkshire could feel. Boston possessed its own forms of grandeur, busy streets, harbors, ships arriving from distant continents. Yet nothing there resembled this immense and patient openness. The land seemed to breathe at a slower pace. As they walked, Thomas occasionally identified landmarks: a ruined sheepfold hidden among hawthorns, a stream crossing beneath an old bridge, a copse of ash trees planted by a farmer who had once lost an argument with nearly every resident of the village and then spent 20 years refusing to discuss the matter. Lucy knew the story in extraordinary detail. Thomas claimed not to remember it. The contradiction suggested otherwise. After nearly an hour, the lane narrowed into a rough track, crossing open farmland. Ahead, the valley broadened. A small stream wound through the landscape like a silver ribbon. Beyond it lay a series of gently sloping fields. Thomas stopped. There, he pointed with his walking stick. For several moments, Eleanor saw nothing remarkable. Only farmland. Healthy farmland. Well-maintained. Orderly. Yet as she looked more carefully, subtle details began to emerge. The stream, the surviving hedgerows, the line of older trees marking a forgotten boundary. And slowly she realized that she was looking not at a single field, but at several former fields merged into one. The ghost of the old landscape remained visible, if one knew how to see it. Meadow stood roughly there, Thomas said. His stick traced an arc across the western side of the pasture. Before Mr. Wilkes's father combined everything. Lucy looked disappointed. That's all? Fields are frequently disappointing when compared with maps. It doesn't resemble a meadow at all. No. Thomas regarded the land thoughtfully. It doesn't. They crossed a stile and entered the pasture. The grass was cropped short by livestock. Very little else grew there. No great variety of flowers, no patches of color, no untidy corners where nature was permitted to improvise. Everything appeared efficient, useful, managed. And standing there beneath the wide Yorkshire sky, Eleanor understood why Beatrice's journals had sounded so mournful. The field was not ugly. Far from it. It simply lacked the wild abundance she had imagined. The sense of countless small lives sharing the same space. She tried to picture what had once existed here. Cornflowers trembling in summer wind, knapweed glowing purple beneath sunlight, butterflies rising from the grass, the low, constant music of bees, moving from blossom to blossom, an entire world hidden within a meadow, gone so gradually that few had noticed its departure. Lucy wandered toward the stream. A few moments later, her voice called from the bank. There's something here. Eleanor and Thomas joined her. The girl stood beside a cluster of weathered stones, half concealed beneath ivy and grass. Nothing remarkable at first glance. Yet when Eleanor brushed away some of the vegetation, she discovered a carved marker, almost entirely worn by time. Only a few letters remained legible. E, ow, B Meadow. The words were barely visible. The stone leaned at an awkward angle, forgotten by nearly everyone who passed. For several moments no one spoke. The stream flowed quietly nearby. Water moved over pebbles with a sound so soft it seemed less like movement than conversation. A pair of wrens darted through the hedge. Above them, clouds drifted slowly across the immense autumn sky. Thomas removed his cap, not ceremoniously, simply out of habit. The gesture somehow felt appropriate. My grandfather used to mention it, he said quietly. The meadow. Lucy turned toward him. You never told me. No one asked. The answer carried no defensiveness, only mild surprise. He looked across the pasture. When I was a boy, people came here in summer to gather flowers. His gaze followed the stream. There were bees everywhere. The admission hung gently in the air. Not dramatic, not nostalgic, merely factual. Yet Eleanor sensed that something important had occurred. A memory spoken aloud after many years of silence. The sunlight shifted. A cloud passed overhead. The field darkened briefly, before brightening once more. And standing beside the forgotten stone, listening to the stream and the distant calls of rooks crossing the valley, Eleanor felt a curious certainty settling within her. Not certainty about how the meadow could be restored, that remained entirely unclear, nor certainty that such a thing was even possible. Rather, she felt certain of something simpler. Beatrice had been right. The bees had never truly been the whole story. The meadow mattered because it represented attention, care, the willingness to leave room in the world for things that possessed no obvious usefulness, for beauty, for wildflowers, for small creatures whose names most people never learned. The valley stretched quietly around them. The old stone marker rested beside the stream, and somewhere beneath the winter-bound soil of the former meadow, unseen roots still slept beneath the frost, waiting patiently for spring, waiting, perhaps, far more patiently than people ever could. The days following their visit to Bee Meadow passed with a curious gentleness, as though the discovery of the forgotten stone beside the stream had altered something subtle within Eleanor, though she could not have said precisely what it was. Nothing outwardly changed. The village remained the same. The lane still wound between its stone walls. The church bell still sounded each quarter hour across the valley. Smoke still rose each morning from cottage chimneys and drifted slowly across the pale winter sky. Yet the world seemed somehow more connected than before. Where once she had seen separate things, a field, a hedge, a garden, a cottage, she now found herself noticing the invisible threads that bound them together. Beatrice, she thought, had spent years seeing those threads. Perhaps that had been the true purpose of her journals, not simply to record bees, not simply to record flowers, but to teach attention. The weather grew steadily colder as November advanced. Frost settled each evening upon the orchard grass and remained there well into the morning. The apple trees stood bare now, their dark branches tracing delicate patterns against the pale sky. At dawn, rooks gathered upon the higher limbs and held lengthy conferences of obvious importance before departing toward the western fields. Eleanor often watched them from the kitchen window while the kettle heated upon the range. There was comfort in such routines, a comfort she had not expected. In Boston, the days following Charles's death had often felt interchangeable, one slipping into another with little distinction. Here, however, every day seemed to possess its own character. One morning arrived beneath silver mist, another beneath brilliant sunlight, a third beneath steady rain that drummed softly against the cottage windows and transformed the garden paths into ribbons of dark earth. The cottage encouraged observation, or perhaps it simply rewarded it. On rainy afternoons, Eleanor would sit in the writing room with one of Beatrice's journals resting open beside her and a blanket across her knees, while outside, the weather moved quietly through the valley. Sometimes she read, sometimes she wrote letters to Clara, sometimes she merely watched the orchard. The bees no longer appeared. Winter had drawn them fully into their hives, yet she found herself thinking about them more often than before, not with anxiety, not with urgency, rather with the patient curiosity one reserves for old friends temporarily absent. One evening, while she was sorting through a collection of loose papers found in the bottom drawer of Beatrice's desk, she discovered a small envelope containing several pressed flowers. The blossoms had faded almost entirely. Their original colors survived only as faint traces, yet each had been carefully labeled in Beatrice's neat handwriting: field scabious, bird's foot trefoil, red clover, knapweed, Bee Meadow, July 1878. Eleanor turned the specimens gently beneath the lamplight. The paper crackled softly. Outside, darkness had settled over the orchard, and the windows reflected the warm glow of the room. For several moments, she sat entirely still. These were not rare flowers, not remarkable flowers. A botanist might have passed them without interest. Yet Beatrice had preserved them for nearly 20 years, because they had belonged to a place she loved. The realization touched Eleanor more deeply than she expected. Love, she was beginning to understand, often revealed itself through attention, not grand declarations, not dramatic sacrifices, but the quiet act of noticing, of remembering, of refusing to allow something precious to vanish entirely. The following week brought the first light snowfall of the season. It arrived during the night and covered the valley in a delicate whiteness that transformed every familiar shape into something softer and more mysterious. When Eleanor opened the front door that morning, the world seemed wrapped in silence. The stone walls, the hedgerows, the orchard, the distant hills, all lay beneath a thin blanket of snow that reflected the pale winter sunlight. Even sound appeared altered. Footsteps became quieter. Voices carried less far. The village seemed to move more slowly, as though respecting the stillness. Lucy arrived shortly before noon, rosy-cheeked and breathless from her walk through the snow. She entered, carrying a basket and an alarming quantity of enthusiasm. "It looks exactly like Christmas cards." "It does," Eleanor agreed. "I've always suspected Christmas cards exaggerate. And now I think Yorkshire has been deliberately imitating them." Lucy appeared satisfied by this explanation. She removed her coat and settled herself beside the fire with the contentment of someone entirely at home. And watching her there, laughing at her own observations and filling the quiet cottage with conversation, Eleanor experienced a realization so gentle she almost missed it. She no longer felt like a visitor. The thought arrived unexpectedly. Not dramatic, not accompanied by any particular event, simply a recognition. The cottage no longer belonged only to Beatrice's memory. A small part of it had begun, somehow, to belong to Eleanor as well. Outside, snow rested lightly upon the sleeping garden. The bare orchard trees stood motionless beneath the pale sky. And within the warmth of Hawthorne Cottage, as afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, Eleanor felt something she had not felt for a very long time. Not happiness exactly, something quieter, something steadier. The feeling of having arrived somewhere without realizing until that very moment that one had been traveling all along. Christmas arrived in Yorkshire quietly, not with sudden excitement or noisy celebration, but with the gradual accumulation of small signs that appeared throughout the village during the final weeks of December, each one so modest by itself that it might easily have gone unnoticed, yet together creating the unmistakable feeling that something cherished was approaching. A wreath appeared upon the church door. A lantern was hung beside the entrance of the post office. Bundles of holly and ivy began to decorate cottage windows. Children carried mysterious parcels through the village lanes, while speaking in voices that suggested secrecy but were far too loud to accomplish it. Even the air seemed different, colder, certainly, yet touched by anticipation. The valley lay beneath a succession of pale winter mornings, during which frost glittered upon every hedge and stone wall. The fields beyond the village shone silver beneath the low sunlight, while the distant hills seemed almost blue in the clear December air. At Hawthorne Cottage, Eleanor found herself participating in preparations she had not expected. Mrs. Hartwell from the bakery arrived one afternoon, carrying a fruitcake wrapped carefully in linen. The following morning, Mrs. Pritchard appeared with a small jar of preserved plums. A day later, a boy delivered a basket of walnuts, accompanied by a note written in Thomas Finch's careful hand, stating only that winter evenings improve considerably when walnuts are available. Lucy arrived frequently and contributed enthusiasm in quantities sufficient for several households. One snowy afternoon, she entered the cottage carrying armfuls of evergreen branches. "Mr. Finch says the house requires decorating." "Does he?" "He claims it looks respectable, And that is a problem? He says respectability should occasionally be interrupted. Eleanor suspected Thomas had never used precisely those words, yet she could imagine the sentiment. Together, they decorated the cottage. The task occupied an entire afternoon. Holly was arranged above doorways. Ivy wound itself around the mantelpiece. A small arrangement of winter greenery appeared beside the kitchen window. As dusk settled outside, and the fire burned warmly within the grate, the cottage seemed transformed. Not dramatically, simply softened, more welcoming, as though it had drawn a little closer around those living inside it. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a sky filled with stars. The snowfall of earlier days had largely disappeared, leaving only small white patches lingering in shaded corners of fields and hedgerows. The roads were firm beneath foot. The air possessed that crisp clarity which often follows frost. The village church stood at the far end of the lane, its ancient stone walls glowing softly beneath lantern light. When Eleanor approached that evening, alongside Thomas and Lucy, she found villagers already gathering beneath the lich gate. Warm breath drifted upward into the cold air. Voices mingled. Boots crunched softly upon frozen gravel. The windows of the church shone golden against the darkness. Inside, the atmosphere was one of extraordinary warmth. Not physical warmth, although several stoves had been lit throughout the building. Something gentler than that. The warmth created whenever people who have known one another for many years gather together in peace. Candles burned along the walls, their light reflected from polished brass and old wood. The scent of beeswax mingled with evergreen branches and the faint aroma of damp wool coats drying after the cold walk through the village. Eleanor took her place midway along a pew beside Lucy. Thomas sat directly ahead. The church slowly filled. Families arrived. Elderly couples settled carefully into familiar seats. Children attempted solemnity and failed. And throughout it all, Eleanor experienced the curious sensation of being included without effort. No one treated her as a visitor. No one introduced her. No one explained her presence. She simply belonged there. The realization came unexpectedly, perhaps because she had not realized how long she had been waiting for it. The service itself passed gently. Carols filled the church. Voices rose beneath the timbered roof. Some strong, some uncertain, some delightfully enthusiastic, despite limited musical accuracy. Lucy sang every verse with unwavering determination. Thomas sang almost none, though Eleanor noticed his lips moving occasionally during the familiar hymns. The rector spoke briefly about winter and hope and the small lights people carry for one another through difficult seasons. Nothing profound. Nothing dramatic, yet the words seemed perfectly suited to the evening. When the final carol ended, the congregation remained seated for several moments, reluctant perhaps to break the spell created by candlelight and music and shared memory. Eventually people rose, conversations resumed, coats were collected, children rediscovered their energy, and the church gradually emptied into the clear winter night. Outside, stars stretched across the Yorkshire sky with remarkable brilliance. The village seemed wrapped in stillness. Only the occasional sound of laughter drifted from groups making their way home. Eleanor stood for a moment beneath the churchyard gate and looked back at the softly illuminated building. The candles still glowed through the windows. Beyond them lay generations of Christmases, generations of villagers who had gathered in that same place beneath winter skies, remarkably similar to this one. For the first time since arriving in Yorkshire, she felt not merely connected to the village's present, but somehow to its past as well. A hand touched her sleeve lightly. She turned. Thomas stood beside her. The old gardener regarded the church thoughtfully for a moment before speaking. Miss Beatrice always liked Christmas Eve. Eleanor smiled. "I think she would have liked tonight." Thomas nodded. "So do I." Nothing more needed saying. Together they began the walk back toward Hawthorne Cottage. Ahead of them, Lucy was already disappearing down the lane, her lantern swinging cheerfully in the darkness, and her voice carrying backward on the cold night air, as she informed the world at large that Christmas had officially begun. The stars shone overhead, frost sparkled along the hedgerows, and somewhere deep within herself, Eleanor felt a quiet certainty settling into place. Not the certainty that she would remain in Yorkshire forever. That question still belonged to the future. But the certainty that she had found, at least for this season, exactly where she was meant to be. Christmas passed quietly and beautifully, leaving behind that peculiar stillness which often settles over villages during the days between Christmas and New Year, when ordinary routines pause and time itself seems content to move more slowly than usual. Snow came and went. Frost returned. The valley rested beneath a succession of pale mornings and long evenings illuminated by firelight and lamps. One afternoon, while searching for a recipe Mrs. Hartwell had insisted must be hidden somewhere among Beatrice's papers, Eleanor discovered a slim notebook tucked behind a row of books in the writing room. It was smaller than the others, older as well. The leather binding had faded almost to the color of dry leaves. Its corners were softened by handling. Unlike Beatrice's field journals, whose pages contained observations of flowers and bees and weather, this notebook bore no title at all, only a date, the final year of Beatrice's life. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window panes. The garden lay silent beneath the grey afternoon sky. A blackbird perched upon the orchard wall, feathers puffed against the cold. Eleanor settled herself beside the fire. The notebook rested quietly in her lap. For several moments she simply looked at it, not from reluctance, but from a growing awareness that certain pages, once opened, alter the way one remembers a person forever. At last, she turned the cover. The entries were short, much shorter than those found in the earlier journals. Some occupied only half a page. A few consisted of little more than observations, thoughts, fragments. Yet as Eleanor continued reading, she began to understand that these final notes contained something more valuable than facts. They contained understanding. The first entry that caught her attention had been written during spring. The handwriting remained steady, though slightly less firm than before. "Today I saw only 3 bees in the orchard. 30 years ago, there would have been hundreds. The difference made me sad for perhaps 5 minutes. Then I remembered that sadness itself accomplishes very little. So I planted another row of lavender." Eleanor smiled despite herself. The sentence sounded exactly like Beatrice, practical, kind, entirely unwilling to surrender to despair. Several pages later, she found another. "The village children asked whether I am lonely. I told them that loneliness and solitude are cousins who resemble one another but possess entirely different temperaments. Loneliness knocks upon the door. Solitude sits quietly by the fire and reads." Lucy would have approved of that distinction enormously. Eleanor could almost hear the girl's response. The thought brought a small warmth to the room. Rain continued falling outside. The fire settled softly within the grate. The cottage seemed wrapped in the gentle hush that often accompanies winter afternoons. She turned another page, another, and gradually a portrait emerged. Not of Beatrice the naturalist, not of Beatrice the keeper of journals, not even of Beatrice the owner of Hawthorne Cottage, but of Beatrice the woman, the person who had spent decades observing the world closely enough to understand that happiness rarely arrived in dramatic forms. It arrived instead disguised as ordinary moments. A kettle singing on the range, a familiar footstep at the gate, a blackbird returning to the same branch each morning, a friend remembered, a flower blooming, where one had nearly forgotten to look. Toward the middle of the notebook, Eleanor found an entry written in January. The handwriting wavered slightly. Perhaps illness had already begun its work, perhaps age alone. Yet the words remained unmistakably clear. I have spent many years believing I was caring for this cottage. I now suspect the cottage has been caring for me. The sentence lingered in Eleanor's thoughts long after she had finished reading it. She glanced around the room. The familiar chair, the shelves, the lamp, the fire, the rain beyond the glass. For the first time, she wondered whether places, like people, occasionally choose their own companions. The afternoon slowly deepened toward evening. Light faded from the orchard. Shadows gathered among the trees. And still Eleanor continued reading. Near the end of the notebook, she discovered several pages devoted entirely to small lists. Not important lists, not financial records, not instructions, simply things Beatrice hoped she would never forget. The smell of apple wood burning on cold evenings, the sound of bees inside foxgloves, the color of sunlight through autumn leaves, fresh bread cooling on a windowsill, the church bell during fog, rooks flying home before snow, the first crocus, the last rose, the sound of rain on the roof while safely indoors. Eleanor read the lists twice, then a third time. Each item appeared almost insignificant. Together they formed a life, a good life, not remarkable from the outside, not famous, not wealthy, yet rich in precisely the ways that mattered most. Only a few pages remained. The handwriting had become smaller, more careful, as though Beatrice understood she was writing toward an ending. The final entry occupied a single page. No date appeared at the top, only several short paragraphs. If the bees leave, plant flowers anyway. If the garden grows quiet, tend it anyway. If no one comes through the gate for a season, keep the gate open anyway. The world rarely returns all at once. It returns in small ways, a single bird, a single bloom, a single visitor. Patience notices what hurry overlooks. Eleanor paused. The rain had stopped. The cottage stood utterly silent. Even the fire seemed quieter. She read the passage again, then once more. At the bottom of the page, beneath the final paragraph, Beatrice had added one last sentence. The handwriting was faint, almost delicate. Take care of whatever has been entrusted to you. That is enough. Nothing followed. No farewell. No dramatic conclusion. No attempt at wisdom larger than the life she had lived. Only that simple instruction. Take care of whatever has been entrusted to you. Eleanor closed the notebook gently. Outside, twilight had settled across the valley. The orchard stood motionless beneath the fading sky. A single lamp glowed in the distant village. For a long while she remained beside the fire without moving, not because she was sad, not because she was grieving, but because she felt, more clearly than ever before, that she had finally understood the gift Beatrice had intended to leave behind. It had never been the cottage, nor the journals, nor even the garden. It was a way of looking at the world, a way of paying attention, a way of loving ordinary things deeply enough that they became extraordinary. The room darkened slowly around her. The final journal rested quietly upon her lap, and somewhere beyond the windows, beyond the sleeping orchard and the winter fields, and the stone walls of the valley, spring was already making its patient journey toward Yorkshire. January settled gently over Yorkshire. The excitement of Christmas faded gradually into the quieter rhythms of winter, leaving behind a season of pale mornings, early sunsets, and evenings spent beside the fire, while wind moved softly through the bare orchard trees. For several weeks, the weather remained cold but calm. Frost silvered the fields each dawn. Thin veils of mist drifted above the lower meadows. The village seemed wrapped in a kind of peaceful hibernation. Life continued. only more slowly, more thoughtfully. Eleanor had come to love these winter mornings. She often rose before full daylight and lit the kitchen fire while darkness still lingered outside the windows. The familiar rituals that once would have seemed ordinary now possessed an unexpected comfort. The filling of the kettle, the arranging of logs beside the grate, the first cup of tea held between her hands while the cottage gradually awakened around her. One Wednesday morning, shortly after the New Year, she found a letter waiting at the post office. Mrs. Hartwell handed it across the counter with a smile. "America again." "America again," Eleanor agreed. The envelope bore Clara's familiar handwriting. Even after all these years, she could recognize it instantly. The letters remained slightly forward-leaning, energetic and purposeful, as though even the words themselves were hurrying toward their destination. She carried the letter home unopened, not because she lacked curiosity, quite the opposite. Letters from Clara had become one of the great pleasures of her weeks, yet Eleanor had developed the habit of reading important correspondence slowly. A good letter deserved its proper setting, and so she waited until afternoon, when the day's small tasks had been completed and the winter light lay softly across the writing room floor. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, not enough to whiten the ground, only enough to soften the distant hills and blur the outlines of the stone walls beyond the orchard. The world seemed wrapped in watercolor. She settled into her chair, poured herself a fresh cup of tea, and opened the letter. As always, Clara began with family news. The boys were healthy. Edward had recently become fascinated by maps and now intended, apparently, to discover the source of every river in Massachusetts. Little Henry had attempted to teach the family cat arithmetic with limited success. The family remained well. Boston remained cold. The house on Ashford Street continued much as it always had. Eleanor smiled as she read. She could hear Clara's voice behind every sentence. Practical, affectionate, occasionally amused despite herself. Several pages passed in this familiar fashion before the tone of the letter shifted. The change was subtle, not dramatic, yet Eleanor recognized it immediately. "My dearest mother, I have been meaning to write the following for several weeks, but I wished first to be certain I was not imagining it. I do not believe I am. The handwriting alone would have told me." Eleanor paused. Outside, snow drifted past the window. The fire gave a soft crackle beside her chair. She continued reading. "When Father died, your letters became very careful. Not unhappy. You never allowed yourself to be unhappy upon paper, but careful, as though every sentence had first been examined before being permitted to leave the house. You wrote of practical matters, the weather, the neighbors, the household accounts. You wrote kindly and thoughtfully, and exactly as a dutiful mother ought. Yet it often seemed to me that the writer stood a little distance away from the page. I understood why, or thought I did." Eleanor lowered the letter for a moment. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. She remembered those months, the effort required to move through ordinary life, the exhaustion hidden beneath every routine, the strange sensation of continuing after losing the person beside whom one had expected to continue forever. Outside, the snowfall thickened slightly. The orchard began to disappear into the whiteness. She returned to the letter. "But your letters from Yorkshire are different, not because of what you write, because of what you notice. You describe birds, clouds, gardens, the color of evening light on stone walls. You tell me stories about a girl named Lucy, and a gardener called Mr. Finch, and a woman named Beatrice, whom I increasingly feel I know myself. You write of weather, as though weather matters. You write of flowers, as though flowers have opinions. And most surprising of all, you occasionally make jokes. Mother, I had almost forgotten that you were funny." Eleanor laughed aloud, a genuine laugh. The sound startled her slightly. The room had been so quiet. She read the passage again, then once more. There was something profoundly moving in being recognized by one's child, not praised, not admired, simply seen. The letter continued. The boys have noticed it too. Henry says grandmother's letters feel warmer now. Edward claims they smell different. I informed him this was impossible. He insists otherwise. I suspect he is correct. Children often notice truths before adults become clever enough to overlook them. The afternoon light had begun to fade. The snow outside transformed the room into a place of soft grey shadows and amber firelight. Eleanor turned the final page. The closing paragraphs were shorter, more personal. I hope you understand that I do not write these things because I miss you less. I miss you very much. The boys miss you. The house misses you. Even the cat appears disappointed by your absence, though she conceals it poorly.
I write because your letters tell me something important. You are happy there. Not excited. Not entertained. Something better. You sound as though you belong to your days again. Father used to say that contentment was the most underrated human achievement.
I think he would be very pleased with you. Eleanor stopped reading. For a long moment she sat perfectly still. The words rested quietly between herself and the fire. Father would be very pleased with you. The sentence touched something deep and tender within her. Not because she required Charles's approval, but because she suddenly realized how often she had wondered what he might think of all this. The cottage, the village, the orchard, Lucy, Thomas, the journals, the long winter afternoons, the slow return of purpose she had scarcely dared name aloud. At last she folded the letter carefully and placed it beside her teacup. Outside, snow continued falling across the valley. The orchard had nearly vanished from view. Only the nearest trees remained visible through the whiteness. And sitting there, in the fading afternoon light, Eleanor understood something she had not fully admitted even to herself. When she had arrived at Hawthorne Cottage, she believed she had come to settle another woman's affairs. Somewhere along the way, without noticing exactly when it had happened, she had begun settling her own. The realization carried no drama, no sudden revelation, only the quiet certainty of a truth that had been waiting patiently for her to catch up with it. The fire burned steadily. The snow fell softly beyond the windows. And for the remainder of the afternoon, Eleanor sat beside the hearth with Clara's letter resting in her lap, feeling the rare comfort of knowing that someone she loved had seen the change in her long before she had fully seen it herself. By the middle of February, winter had begun, almost imperceptibly, to loosen its hold upon the valley. Not surrender, not yet. Yorkshire knew better than to trust February completely. Snow still visited from time to time. Morning frost still silvered the hedgerows. The wind that came across the moors retained enough cold to remind every sensible person that spring remained some distance away. And yet small changes had begun, the sort of changes that reveal themselves only to those who have learned to pay attention. One morning, Eleanor noticed that the dawn arrived several minutes earlier than it had a month before. Another afternoon, she realized that she no longer needed to light the lamps quite so early. The evenings remained short, but no longer impossibly short. The world was expanding again. A little more daylight each day, a little more sky, a little more time. The realization pleased her more than she would once have believed possible. She had never considered herself particularly attentive to seasons. Like many people who spend most of their lives in towns and cities, she had previously regarded weather as something that happened beyond the windows, while more important matters occupied one's attention. Hawthorne Cottage had altered that perception. Life here moved differently. The seasons were not background scenery. They were participants. The garden changed them. The orchard reflected them. The birds announced them. Even the old stone walls seemed to acknowledge their passing. One pale morning, she stepped outside shortly after breakfast and found Thomas already at work near the apiary. The sky hung low and pearl-colored above the valley. A faint mist drifted across the lower fields. The grass remained brittle with frost. Thomas stood examining one of the hives with the solemn concentration he usually reserved for matters involving fruit trees, weather forecasts, or parish disagreements. "Good morning," Eleanor called. He nodded without looking up. "Morning." She approached. The hive stood silent. No movement, no bees, nothing to suggest life. Only weathered wood beneath a winter sky. Thomas rested a hand upon one of the hive roofs. "They'll wake soon." Eleanor glanced toward the entrance. "It doesn't look very promising." "No." His eyes remained fixed on the hive. "It never does." The answer puzzled her. Thomas noticed. A faint smile appeared beneath his grey mustache. "That's the trick of February." He tapped the side of the hive gently. "Everything important happens while it still looks dead." Eleanor laughed softly. The remark sounded suspiciously like something Beatrice might have written. Or perhaps something Thomas had learned after spending 30 years listening to her. They stood quietly together for a moment. The valley stretched away below them in muted shades of grey and silver. Smoke rose from village chimneys. A rook crossed the distant sky. Nothing appeared to be happening, and yet the stillness felt different now, less final, more expectant, as though the landscape itself had begun listening for something. Several days later, she discovered the first snowdrops, not in the garden, not even near the cottage, but beside the churchyard wall during one of her walks to the village. The flowers emerged from the cold ground with such determination that Eleanor stopped walking entirely. They were tiny, almost absurdly small, white petals hanging like little lanterns above the damp earth. Most people passed them without noticing. Mrs. Hartwell later admitted she had walked past them twice that morning herself. Yet once seen, they became impossible to ignore. Eleanor found herself smiling at them every time she passed. Their appearance seemed less like a botanical event and more like a message, a quiet announcement from the earth itself. "We are still here. Do not worry." The following week brought rain, several days of it. Gentle rain, persistent rain, the sort that seemed less interested in making a spectacle of itself than in accomplishing useful work. The snow vanished. The frost retreated. Water dripped steadily from the orchard branches. The fields darkened. The air softened. And one afternoon, while sitting beside the kitchen window with a cup of tea and one of Beatrice's journals, Eleanor noticed movement outside. At first, she thought it was merely a leaf, something blown loose from a hedge. Then the movement returned. A second later, she saw it clearly. A bee. Only one. It moved somewhat uncertainly through the damp afternoon air, zigzagging above the garden border before disappearing beyond the stone wall. The sight lasted perhaps 3 seconds, no more. Yet Eleanor remained at the window long afterward, watching, waiting, half expecting it to return. It did not, but that scarcely mattered. The bee existed. That was enough. That evening she mentioned it to Thomas. He nodded with great satisfaction. "Early. Is that unusual?" "Not really." He stirred the fire with the poker. "Strong colonies send out scouts when the weather softens." "Scouts?" "Aye." He settled back into his chair. "Someone has to go first." The firelight flickered across the room. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Eleanor considered the idea. A single bee, leaving the safety of the hive, searching, testing the season, looking for signs that the world beyond winter might once again be trusted. The image lingered in her thoughts. Later that night, after Thomas had gone home and darkness had settled fully across the valley, she sat in the writing room with one of Beatrice's journals open upon her lap. The entry she happened to read had been written many years earlier. The handwriting remained firm and confident. Today the first bee appeared. She seemed surprised to find that winter had ended. I was equally surprised. We stood regarding one another for several moments. Then she flew away to continue her business. I returned to mine. Eleanor smiled. Some observations never grew old. She turned another page, then another. Outside, wind moved softly through the orchard branches. The cottage settled around her with its familiar creaks and murmurs. The clock ticked. The fire burned low, and for the first time since arriving at Hawthorne Cottage, Eleanor found herself looking forward, not merely to tomorrow, but to an entire season she had not yet seen. Spring was coming, slowly, patiently, in the old Yorkshire manner, not with fanfare, not with sudden transformations, but through small arrivals. A flower, a longer evening, a single bee, and sitting there beside the fading firelight, Eleanor thought that perhaps the finest changes in life often arrived exactly the same way, not all at once, but one quiet sign at a time. March settled gently over Hawthorne Cottage. The hard edges of winter softened day by day, though no one could have said exactly when the change began. One morning, there was frost upon the orchard grass. The next, there was only dew. A week later, the hedgerows seemed touched by a faint green haze. Then suddenly, almost without warning, the valley no longer looked asleep. The transformation happened quietly, as all worthwhile transformations seem to happen. The fields beyond the stone wall deepened from winter brown into muted shades of green. Lambs appeared in distant meadows. Birds grew louder in the mornings. The air itself changed, carrying less smoke and more earth, as though the ground had finally decided to breathe again after months of holding itself still beneath the cold. The garden behind Hawthorne Cottage reflected these changes more slowly. Winter had left its mark. The borders were untidy. Several paths had sunk beneath moss and weeds. The wooden edging around the flower beds leaned at uncertain angles. A section of fencing near the orchard required replacing. The rose arches looked tired. The lavender beds needed attention. Yet there was nothing neglected about the place, only the natural disorder that follows a long season of rest. One bright morning, near the end of March, Eleanor stepped outside after breakfast and found Thomas already unloading tools from a wheelbarrow. A second wheelbarrow stood nearby. Lucy appeared moments later, carrying an armful of gardening twine and wearing an expression of determined importance. The sight made Eleanor smile. "You appear to have assembled a workforce." Thomas glanced up. "Seems so." Lucy set down the twine. "We're beginning the south border today." Eleanor laughed softly. "Are we?" "We are." The girl nodded with complete certainty. "Mr. Finch says if we wait any longer, the weeds will think they've won." Thomas cleared his throat. I may have said something similar. The three of them spent the morning working among the flower beds. There was nothing remarkable about the labor itself. No dramatic discoveries, no hidden treasures, only ordinary tasks repeated patiently. Dead stems were removed. Borders were edged. The soil was loosened and turned. Old leaves were gathered into baskets. Broken branches were carried away. The work progressed slowly. No one seemed inclined to hurry. Above them, the sky remained clear and pale blue. The sun possessed warmth now, though only enough to be pleasant rather than hot. Blackbirds sang from the orchard. Somewhere beyond the village, a church bell marked the passing hours. By noon, the south border already looked different. Not finished, merely cared for. The distinction mattered. Eleanor rested beside the stone wall with a cup of tea, while Lucy knelt nearby, examining packets of seeds that Thomas had brought from his cottage. Most were old-fashioned flowers, foxgloves, sweet peas, larkspur, cornflowers, lavender. The packets themselves looked aged. Some had clearly been stored for years. Lucy held one up. "Did Miss Beatrice buy these?" Thomas looked over. His weathered face softened slightly. "Aye." He lifted the packet from her hands. The paper had faded with time. A small note, written in careful handwriting, appeared upon one corner. "Plant near the orchard wall. Morning sun." Eleanor immediately recognized the writing. Beatrice. The sight produced an unexpected feeling. Not sadness, something gentler, a sense of companionship that crossed years. Thomas folded the packet carefully. She always bought more seeds than she needed. "Why?" Lucy asked. Thomas shrugged. "Hope, I suppose." The answer lingered among them. Hope. Not a grand hope. Not ambition. Not expectation. Simply the quiet belief that another season would come, that flowers would bloom, that gardens should continue. The afternoon passed in much the same manner. They planted rows of young lavender near the old stone path. Lucy insisted upon measuring every interval precisely. Thomas pretended to object, but secretly approved. Eleanor found herself kneeling beside the girl, pressing roots gently into fresh soil while the scent of earth rose around them. It was pleasant work, honest work, the sort of work that occupied both hands and mind, without burdening either. Toward evening, they moved to the neglected corner near the orchard where Beatrice had once kept a small cutting garden. The soil there remained surprisingly rich. Years of fallen leaves had fed it well. Thomas leaned upon his spade and surveyed the space. "What shall we put here?" Lucy considered the question seriously. Something beautiful, a dangerous suggestion. "Why?" "Because nearly everything qualifies." The girl laughed. Eleanor watched them. The old gardener, the village child, the cottage, the orchard, the newly planted beds. The scene possessed no particular significance, and yet she felt oddly grateful for it. Months earlier, she would never have imagined spending an afternoon discussing flower placement in a Yorkshire garden. Still less would she have imagined enjoying it. Thomas began marking rows. Lucy followed with packets of seeds. The light gradually shifted toward gold. Long shadows stretched across the grass. Somewhere in the orchard, a robin settled for the evening. The world seemed content, not triumphant, not transformed, simply content. As they gathered tools at the end of the day, Eleanor glanced back toward the garden. Freshly turned earth darkened the borders. New plants waited quietly beneath the soil. Nothing had flowered yet. Nothing appeared especially impressive. The garden looked almost unchanged, and yet she knew it was different. The difference simply lay hidden for now, much like spring itself, much like many things worth waiting for. Thomas followed her gaze. "Looks better." "It does," he nodded. Then, after a moment, added quietly, "Miss Beatrice always said a garden doesn't need a reason to bloom." The evening breeze moved softly through the orchard branches. Lucy had already gone ahead toward the lane. The last light lingered upon the cottage windows. Eleanor stood looking across the newly planted beds. A garden doesn't need a reason to bloom. The words felt strangely important, not only for gardens, perhaps for people as well. And as the first stars appeared above the valley, she found herself thinking that the work they had done today had never truly been about flowers, nor had it been about the bees, or even about preserving Beatrice's memory. They had done it because some places deserved care, simply because they existed. Some things were worth tending, worth nurturing, worth helping forward into another season. And standing there in the soft gold light of a Yorkshire evening, with the scent of fresh earth still lingering in the air, and the orchard darkening gently beyond the garden wall, Eleanor suspected that this simple truth might be one of the most valuable things Beatrice had left behind. April arrived during the night, not upon a calendar, not in any official sense, but in the older manner by which the countryside recognizes the changing of seasons, a softness in the air, a different quality of light, a quiet assurance that winter, however stubbornly it might linger, in shaded corners and beneath hedgerows, had finally lost its argument with the year. Eleanor noticed it the moment she opened her eyes. The bedroom felt different. The light filtering through the curtains possessed a pale golden warmth absent only days before. Even before she rose from bed, she could hear birds outside the window, not the occasional winter call of a solitary robin, but a lively conversation involving several species apparently eager to announce the morning to one another. She dressed slowly. The cottage remained quiet. The familiar creak of floorboards accompanied her downstairs. The kettle was set upon the stove. A small fire was coaxed into life. Soon the kitchen filled with the comforting scents of tea leaves, warm bread, and wood smoke. Outside, the sky stretched clear and blue above the valley. The previous day's rain had washed the landscape clean. Everything appeared freshly made. By the time Eleanor carried her tea into the garden, sunlight had begun spilling over the eastern hills. The orchard glowed with the delicate colors of early spring. Tiny blossoms had appeared among the branches. Not many, just enough to suggest what would follow. The grass sparkled with dew. The stone walls still held traces of coolness from the night, and along the edge of the path, beside the border, planted only weeks before, the first lavender blooms had opened. Eleanor stopped walking. The flowers were modest, small, almost shy, soft purple against fresh green leaves. She knelt beside them and smiled. For months, she had imagined this moment, not because lavender was rare, nor because it was particularly dramatic, but because it marked a promise fulfilled. The garden had accepted their efforts. The season was moving forward. Life was returning. She sat upon the stone bench beneath the orchard wall and sipped her tea. The morning remained wonderfully still. No wind, no voices, only birdsong and the distant murmur of a stream beyond the lower meadow. For several minutes nothing happened. The garden simply existed around her. Sunlight warming stone, dew evaporating from grass, shadows shortening gradually as the morning advanced. It was enough, more than enough. Then she heard it, a sound so faint she almost mistook it for imagination. A soft vibration, a brief hum, gone as quickly as it had arrived. Eleanor lowered her cup, listened. Silence returned. She smiled at herself. Perhaps she had been hoping too eagerly, yet only moments later the sound came again, this time unmistakable, a gentle buzzing, moving somewhere among the flowers. She stood, set down her teacup, and walked slowly toward the lavender border. There, hovering uncertainly above the blossoms, was a bee, a single bee. Its golden body caught the morning sunlight as it moved from flower to flower with careful concentration. Eleanor remained perfectly still. The tiny creature appeared entirely occupied with its work and showed no interest whatsoever in the woman watching nearby. It visited one bloom, then another, then another. The simple ordinariness of the scene affected her more deeply than she would have expected. Months earlier, the hives had stood silent. The garden had felt abandoned. Beatrice's journals had spoken of absence, of waiting, of uncertainty. And now here, beneath a clear April sky, a bee moved calmly among blooming lavender, as though no interruption had ever occurred, as though returning had been the most natural thing in the world. A sudden voice behind her broke the silence.
I knew they'd come.
Lucy stood at the gate. She must have arrived only moments before. Her cheeks were pink from the walk. A basket hung from one arm. Eleanor smiled. You frightened me. Sorry. The girl lowered her voice immediately, then pointed. Look, I am looking. No. Lucy grinned. Look over there. Eleanor followed the direction of her finger. Another bee had appeared. Then a third. The newcomers moved between blossoms. with the same patient purpose as the first. The air above the lavender seemed subtly more alive, not crowded, not dramatic, simply occupied, as though a forgotten conversation had quietly resumed. A few minutes later, Thomas arrived carrying tools for work in the orchard. Lucy rushed toward him. Words tumbled out too quickly to be understood. Thomas listened, then walked toward the border. He stood beside Eleanor. Neither spoke immediately. The old gardener removed his cap, not ceremoniously, not theatrically, simply as one does before something deserving respect. Together, they watched the bees. The creatures moved steadily among the flowers, indifferent to observation. Their return carried none of the grandeur Eleanor might once have imagined. No sudden swarm filled the sky. No miraculous transformation occurred. The garden remained exactly what it had been yesterday. Only now, it contained bees, and somehow that was enough. Perhaps more than enough. Thomas eventually cleared his throat. Strong little things. Eleanor nodded. They are. The old man looked across the garden. His eyes lingered briefly upon the cottage, the orchard, the hives, the stone paths, the flowering border. Miss Beatrice would have liked this. It was the first time he had mentioned her all morning. Neither Eleanor nor Lucy replied. Nothing needed adding. The statement felt complete. The three of them remained there for some time, watching, listening, allowing the moment to settle naturally around them. Above the garden, the sky deepened toward a richer blue. The scent of lavender drifted softly through the warming air. Birdsong filled the orchard, and beneath it all ran the gentle sound of wings, a quiet music, small, persistent, alive. As the morning continued and the sunlight spread across Hawthorne Cottage, Eleanor found herself thinking about the long winter that had preceded this day. The silent hives, the frozen fields, the uncertainty. How easy it had been then to believe that absence was permanent. How difficult it had been to imagine this simple scene. Yet here it was. Not because anyone had forced it, not because anyone had rescued it, only because life, given patience and care, had slowly remembered its way back. The bees moved among the lavender. The garden breathed. And somewhere deep within herself, Eleanor felt the same gentle return. The day on which Eleanor finally made her decision arrived without ceremony. No extraordinary event announced it. No revelation descended from the heavens. No conversation suddenly altered the course of her thoughts. Instead, it came in the same quiet manner that most important truths seemed to arrive at Hawthorne Cottage. Slowly, patiently, after weeks of standing unnoticed at the edge of awareness. The morning passed much like any other. She spent an hour in the garden with Lucy, who had become deeply concerned about the welfare of several young sweet peas, and now inspected them daily with the seriousness of a physician making rounds through a hospital ward. Thomas worked among the fruit trees in the orchard. The bees moved steadily between the lavender and the early blossoms. The valley rested beneath a sky so perfectly blue that it seemed almost painted. Nothing remarkable happened, yet throughout the day, Eleanor carried within her the strange sensation that something had quietly settled into place, like the final piece of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling. Toward evening, the air grew cooler. The long spring sunlight stretched across the garden, turning the stone walls honey gold and filling the orchard with soft shadows. The scent of lavender drifted through the open windows of the cottage. Somewhere beyond the lane, a blackbird sang from the top of a hawthorn tree, repeating the same liquid phrase again and again, as though entirely satisfied with its composition. After supper, Eleanor carried a lamp into the writing room. The room had become her favorite place in the cottage, not because it was particularly grand. It was not. The ceiling was low, the furniture was simple, the shelves bowed slightly beneath the weight of old books. Yet every corner seemed touched by Beatrice's quiet presence. The desk stood where it always had. The window overlooked the garden. The evening light still entered at precisely the same angle it had entered when Beatrice sat there years before, writing in her journals while the bees moved among the flowers outside. Eleanor lit the lamp. A warm amber glow spread across the polished wood. Outside, dusk deepened slowly over the valley. The last sunlight lingered among the orchard branches. The bees had mostly returned to their hives. Only an occasional late worker crossed the garden now. The world seemed to be preparing itself for rest. She drew a sheet of cream-colored paper toward her, dipped her pen, and wrote, "My dearest Clara." The words came easily, more easily than she had expected. For several moments, she sat quietly, listening to the faint scratching of her pen and the distant evening sounds drifting through the open window. Then she began. She wrote of spring arriving in Yorkshire, of the orchard blossoms, of Lucy's determination to supervise every flower bed personally, of Thomas, who still pretended to dislike praise while secretly thriving upon it. She described the first lavender blooms, the bees, the scent of the garden after rain, the way sunlight settled upon the stone walls each evening. She wrote about ordinary things, the sort of things she once might have considered too small to mention, yet they no longer seemed small, not after the winter she had lived through, not after discovering how much of life was built from precisely such details. As the letter grew, she found herself smiling. She could almost imagine Clara reading it in Boston, could picture the familiar parlor, the boys playing nearby, the fire, the city sounds beyond the windows, the entire life she had once expected to return to. And still, as she imagined it all, she felt no pull toward leaving. Only affection, only gratitude. The realization surprised her less than it might have months earlier, because somewhere along the way, Hawthorne Cottage had ceased feeling temporary. Without announcing the fact, it had become home. She paused. The pen rested above the page. Outside, the last light faded from the orchard. A faint breeze stirred the lavender. The lamp flame trembled gently, and suddenly she knew exactly what remained to be written. Not because she had planned the sentence, because it was true. She bent once more over the paper. "My dear Clara, I believe I have found where the next chapter of my life wishes to be written." She stopped, read the sentence, then continued. "For many months I thought I had come to Yorkshire to settle another person's affairs. I believed I was caring for a cottage, a garden, and a collection of journals left behind by a woman I greatly admired. What I did not understand at the time was that these things were also caring for me." The words flowed steadily now. She wrote of Beatrice, of the cottage, of the quiet comfort of useful work, of friendships that had arrived unexpectedly, of mornings filled with birdsong, of evenings spent beside the fire, of discovering that grief and contentment could occupy the same heart without troubling one another. At last she reached the final page. Outside, night had fully arrived. Only the lamp illuminated the room. The garden beyond the window existed now only as shadow and memory. The scent of lavender lingered faintly in the darkness. Eleanor rested her hand for a moment upon the paper, then wrote the sentence Clara had perhaps been expecting for months. "If you do not mind, my darling, I should like to stay." The words looked remarkably simple, almost too simple, yet they carried within them an entire season. A winter, a garden, a cottage, a friendship, 100 small moments that had gradually changed the direction of a life. She finished the letter, folded it carefully, addressed the envelope, then sat quietly for a long time without moving. The cottage settled around her. A floorboard creaked upstairs. The clock in the sitting room marked the hour. Outside, somewhere near the hives, a faint night breeze moved through the lavender. Eleanor rose at last and crossed to the window. The valley lay beneath the stars. A few distant lights glowed from cottages in the village below. The orchard stood dark and peaceful. The garden rested. Tomorrow would bring another ordinary day. There would be flowers to tend, letters to post, tea to make, perhaps a visit from Lucy, certainly a conversation with Thomas. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, and for the first time in many years, that prospect filled her with a deep and satisfying happiness. She remained at the window for several minutes, looking out across the sleeping garden. Then she smiled softly to herself, not because she had made a decision, because she finally understood that the decision had been made long ago, perhaps on a winter afternoon beside the fire, perhaps among the first snowdrops, perhaps while planting lavender with Lucy and Thomas, or perhaps the moment she had first stepped through the gate of Hawthorne Cottage and felt, without yet recognizing it, that something within her had begun quietly turning toward home. The lamp glowed warmly behind her, the stars shone above the valley, and resting upon the desk, ready for the morning post, lay a letter carrying the simplest and most important truth she had written in many years. She was staying. June deepened gently around Hawthorne Cottage. Not suddenly, not in any way that one could mark upon a calendar. Rather, the season unfolded day by day through 1,000 small transformations that only those who remained still long enough could fully notice. The roses opened, the orchard thickened with leaves, the hedgerows softened, and the bees, having returned in April, now moved through the garden with such quiet confidence that it seemed impossible to remember a time when they had ever been absent. The cottage itself appeared settled into summer. The windows stood open from morning until evening. Curtains stirred in the mild air. The scent of lavender drifted through every room. Even the old floorboards seemed to creak less in warm weather, as though the entire house had relaxed. On one particular evening near the end of June, Eleanor carried her work basket into the garden shortly before sunset and sat upon the stone bench beneath the old pear tree. The day had been warm, not hot, simply generous. The sort of day that left behind a pleasant tiredness and encouraged one to linger outdoors long after supper. The western sky glowed with layers of pale gold and rose. Sunlight rested upon the tops of the orchard trees. The stone walls shone softly. Somewhere beyond the lower meadow, a blackbird sang its final song before night. Eleanor laid aside her sewing and simply watched. There was very little to do now. The borders were flourishing. The paths were neat. The hives were active. The cottage no longer felt neglected. The work that had occupied the winter and spring had quietly become ordinary maintenance, the sort of care that accompanies affection rather than rescue. A movement near the gate caught her attention. Lucy appeared carrying a small basket beneath one arm. The girl was taller than when Eleanor had first met her, only months earlier, or perhaps she merely carried herself differently now. There was a confidence in her movements that had not existed in January. She paused beside the gate, waved, then continued along the lane toward the village. Halfway down the road she turned and waved once more. Eleanor raised a hand in return. The gesture seemed absurdly familiar, as though they had repeated it for years. She watched until the girl disappeared beyond the bend. The lane grew quiet again. Only a few moments later she heard another sound, the slow, deliberate rhythm of a spade entering soil. Thomas. He was working at the far end of the garden near the orchard wall. The old gardener had insisted upon planting one final row of late summer flowers before declaring the season officially satisfactory. Eleanor suspected he would continue improving the garden indefinitely while claiming each week that he was nearly finished. He paused occasionally to examine a plant, or straighten a stake, or simply stand with one hand resting upon his spade while contemplating some private horticultural problem. The sight brought a smile to Eleanor's face. There was comfort in seeing people exactly where they belonged. Thomas belonged in a garden, Lucy belonged on the village lane, and increasingly, she realized, she belonged here as well. The sunlight lowered gradually, the shadows lengthened, a warm breeze moved through the lavender, and with it came the familiar sound, the bees. They moved among the flowers in the long golden light of evening. Not many, only enough to remind the garden of their presence. One settled upon a foxglove, another disappeared among the roses. A third drifted lazily above the lavender, before vanishing toward the hives. Eleanor watched them for a long time. She thought of Beatrice, not with sadness, not anymore. The older woman no longer seemed absent. Her presence remained everywhere, in the journals, in the orchard, in the careful arrangement of the garden paths, in the bees. Most of all, perhaps, in the simple fact that the cottage continued to be loved. That, Eleanor suspected, was all Beatrice had ever hoped for. Not permanence, not remembrance, only continuation. A life passed gently into other hands, a garden cared for by those who came after. The evening deepened, the sky softened from gold to amber, then from amber to rose. The first star appeared above the distant hills. Thomas finished his work and leaned upon the gate. He raised a hand in farewell. Eleanor returned the gesture. Neither felt any need to speak across the distance. The silence between old friends often contains everything necessary. Soon, he too disappeared down the lane. The garden belonged once more to evening. A faint thread of smoke rose from the cottage chimney. The scent of lavender lingered in the cooling air. The bees returned one by one to their hives. Birdsong faded. The valley settled toward night. Eleanor remained upon the bench. The quiet around her felt complete, not empty, complete. There was an important difference. For many years after Arthur's death, she had mistaken solitude for absence. She had believed that what was gone could never truly be replaced, and perhaps it could not. Yet life, she now understood, did not ask to replace what had been lost. It simply continued. It offered new friendships, new routines, new mornings, new reasons to rise and open the curtains, not instead of the old ones, alongside them. The last sunlight rested briefly upon the cottage windows. For a moment the glass shone like gold. Then the light slipped away. Night approached softly across the valley. Eleanor rose. She gathered her sewing basket, and before returning indoors, she turned for one final look at the garden, the flowers, the orchard, the hives, the winding paths, the stone walls glowing faintly beneath the evening sky. Everything appeared exactly as it should. A garden restored, a cottage inhabited, a life continuing. And somewhere among the lavender, now nearly hidden by dusk, a single bee settled for the night. The small sound of its wings disappeared into the silence. The garden rested, the cottage rested. And at last, after many seasons of wandering, without quite knowing what she sought, Eleanor rested too. The summer evening closed gently around Hawthorne Cottage. The stars emerged above Yorkshire, and the bees, having found their way home again, slept among the flowers. And now the garden is quiet. The cottage rests beneath the stars. The bees sleep among the lavender. The valley has fallen still. If sleep has not yet found you, perhaps it is very close now. Perhaps it is already waiting just beyond the next breath. Thank you for spending this evening at Hawthorne Cottage. May your dreams be gentle. May your rest be deep. And until we meet again, good night.